He carried his point, however, and the same night the battalion went over the river with Graf in command of the leading rubber dinghy. During the hours of darkness, Corps HQ heard from both divisions that they had their reconnaissance troops across the Loire. I immediately went forward, and could not help being impressed on my arrival there by the immensity of the river. At the western crossing point, in Grades, there was a powerful current running, and the distance from bank to bank measured close on 600 yards. 2 arches of the high bridge had been blown, and the intervening gap was to be closed by a pontoon bridge. To compensate for a difference in height of almost 30 feet, a steep ramp had to be installed. Since it proved hazardous enough to drive up this even in a Kübelwagen, all the heavy types of vehicles still had to be ferried across. No easy task in view of the breadth of the river, the strong current, and the numerous sandbanks. The position was simpler at Chalon, the other crossing point, for here the river split into 3 tributaries. The bridges over the 2 northern branches had fallen into our hands intact, leaving us only a stretch of 160 yards to span. At this spot I was to witness a most unusual duel. While the only French troops to be seen on the opposite bank during the morning had been unarmed, heavy tanks subsequently showed up there in the course of the afternoon. The forces we had ferried so far had been unable to halt them, since they still had no means of getting any guns across. So, from a position by the Chalon Bridge, I saw an 88 mm German AA gun and a heavy French tank come into position simultaneously on opposite sides of the river and open fire on one another at the very same instant. Unfortunately, our own gun was immediately knocked out. The very next moment, however, its place was taken by a light anti-tank gun, which was lucky enough to score a direct hit on the one weak spot in front of the enemy 32-tonner. The latter immediately burst into flames. That evening I moved into the castle of Serrant near Chalon. It was an imposing building of tremendous size, flanked by massive towers and arranged in the form of a horseshoe around ceremonial gardens. Round it all flowed a moat. The castle belonged to the Duc de la Trémouille, Prince de Tarente, one of the leading names of ancient France. The dukes had gained the latter title by marriage in about 1500 as the hereditary right of the Anjou family in Naples. They did not, however, win the Neapolitan throne, of which Ferdinand the Catholic took possession. Together with Béarn, a Trémouille had the sole right to the title of Chevalier sans peur et sans reproche. In addition to the wonderful library, the castle contained a wealth of historical mementos, including many from the days when its masters were supporters of the Stuarts. The ground floor was closed, as this was one of the castles being used to store the furniture from the Palace of Versailles. I myself occupied an upstairs room in one of the towers, fully furnished for a grand lever, with a bed of state under a 25-foot-high canopy. Adjoining it was an equally splendid dressing room with a wonderful coffered ceiling in barrel vaulting. The castle, the outer walls of which were coated in white sandstone and the towers built of pebbles, lay in a huge park. A magnificent staircase under an arched Renaissance ceiling led up to the chambers on the first floor, a number of which were beautifully panelled and hung with paintings and the most delightful Gobelin tapestries. It goes without saying that here, as in all other quarters we occupied, the owner's property was respected and treated with the most scrupulous care. By 22nd June we had succeeded in getting 26 divisions over the Loire. Their reconnaissance units pressed a little further still to accept the surrender of countless French troops. On 23rd June we learnt that an armistice had been signed in Compiègne the previous day. The French campaign was over. In a corps order of the day I felt it proper to thank the divisions under my command, none of which I pointed out had enjoyed the benefits of armoured protection or mechanical propulsion, for their self-sacrifice, bravery, and joint achievements. As the sequel to a successful assault operation, they had made possible a 300-mile pursuit which had every right to be called the Assault March to the Loire. The wheel had turned. The road from Compiègne 1918 to Compiègne 1940 had been a long one. Where would it take us from here? The day the French laid down their arms erased one of the blackest memories in the minds of the Germans, that of the surrender of 11th November 1918, signed in Marshal Foch's railway coach at Compiègne. Now France was having to sign her own capitulation at the same place and in that same coach. 22nd June 1940 marked the peak of Hitler's career. France, the threat of whose military might had hovered over Germany since 1918, was eliminated as an opponent of the Reich, just like her eastern satellites before her. Britain, even if by no means finally beaten, had been driven off the continent. And although the Soviet Union, now a neighbour of the Reich, constituted a latent threat in the east despite the Moscow Pact, she was hardly likely, in view of the German victories over Poland and France, to turn aggressive in the near future. If indeed the Kremlin had ever contemplated exploiting Germany's engagement in the West to carry out further expansion, it had apparently missed its chance. Evidently it had not allowed for the possibility of the Wehrmacht's winning so swift and decisive a victory over the Allied armies. That the Wehrmacht had achieved such successes in Poland and France certainly did not mean that its leaders had been working for a war of revenge ever since that first day of Compiègne. Contrary to all the claims of hostile propagandists, the plain fact is that General Staff policy in the years between 1918 and 1939, thanks to a sober appreciation of the dangers that would threaten the Reich in the event of hostilities, was not to wage a war of aggression or revenge, but to safeguard the security of the Reich. Admittedly, the military leaders had ultimately allowed Hitler to outmaneuver them, just as it may be said that they accepted the preeminence of politics. Even politics they did not agree with, but could have prevented only by a coup d'état. For the rest, the extent of the rearmament which Hitler had done everything possible to promote was far from being the only reason for the successes now attained. Certainly, considering the state of defencelessness dictated to Germany at Versailles, rearmament had been a prior necessity for the successful conduct of a war. But there could be no question of the Wehrmacht's having had anything like the preponderance which was later to be enjoyed by the Soviet Union on land and the Western powers in the air. Indeed, as far as the number of formations, tanks and guns went, the Western powers had been equal, and in some respects even superior, to the Germans. It was not weight of armaments that had decided the campaign in the West, but the higher quality of the troops and better leadership on the German side. While not forgetting the immutable laws of warfare, the Wehrmacht had simply learnt a thing or two since 1918. After the armistice, OKH started taking steps to demobilize a considerable number of divisions. At the same time, certain infantry divisions were to become either armoured or motorized. The headquarters of 38 Corps was initially moved into the region of Sancerre, on the middle reaches of the Loire, to handle the conversion of a number of these divisions. We thus exchanged the splendid castle of Serrant, filled with so many historical memories, for a smaller chateau built by the manufacturer of the world-famous Cointreau at the summit of a steep hill overlooking the Loire Valley. Our new home was supposed to represent an ancient stronghold, and had all the hallmarks of bad taste usually found in imitations of this kind. The effect was not improved by a tower near the living premises that had actually been built to look like a ruin. Nor did the little cannons along the terrace bear as much resemblance to war trophies as their owner, the liqueur manufacturer, might have hoped. The only beautiful thing about the place was the view from the top of the hill over the far-flung, fertile valley of the Loire. One indication of the parvenu mentality of the owner could be found in a big picture hanging in his study. It depicted, ranged around a circular table, the crowned heads of Europe at the turn of the century, our own Kaiser, the old Emperor Franz Joseph, Queen Victoria, and so forth. Unfortunately, they all looked as if they had taken more Cointreau than was good for them. On his feet beside the table was the owner himself, triumphantly brandishing a glass of his own liqueur. The removal of this monstrosity was the one change we made in that chateau. On 19th of July, all senior Wehrmacht commanders were summoned to Berlin to attend the Reichstag session, at which Hitler announced the end of the campaign in the West. On the same occasion, he expressed the gratitude of the nation by honouring a number of high military leaders, doing so on a scale which implied that he thought the war as good as won. Natural as the German people found it to honour meritorious soldiers, we army men felt the distinctions now bestowed overstepped the bounds of necessity both in character and scope. Hitler's appointment of a dozen field marshals and one grand admiral simultaneously was bound to detract from the prestige of a rank which had previously been considered the most distinguished in Germany. Hitherto, apart from the few field marshals nominated by Kaiser Wilhelm II in peacetime, one needed to have led a campaign in person, to have won a battle or taken a fortress to qualify for this dignity. At the end of the Polish campaign, during which the commander-in-chief and both the army group commanders had fulfilled these requirements, Hitler had not seen fit to express his thanks to the army by making these men field marshals. Yet now he was creating a dozen simultaneously. They included, apart from the commander-in-chief, who had fought 2 brilliant campaigns, the chief of OKW, who had held neither a command nor the post of a chief of staff. Another was the Under-Secretary of State for the Luftwaffe, who, valuable as his feats of organisation had been, really could not be ranked on a par with the Commander-in-Chief of the army. The most blatant indication of Hitler's attitude was the way he raised Goering over the heads of the army and navy commanders-in-chief by appointing him Reich Marshal and making him the sole recipient of the Grand Cross of the Iron Cross. In the circumstances, this method of distributing the honours could only be regarded as a deliberate slight to Versabrauchitsch, and showed all too clearly what Hitler thought of OKH. On the day of the Reichstag session, I learnt that our Corps HQ was earmarked for a new role. We were moved to the Channel coast to prepare for the invasion of England, 3 infantry divisions being placed under our command. Our billets were in Le Touquet, an elegant seaside resort near Boulogne, where a number of English people owned pretty villas. While the HQ took over one of the incredibly luxurious hotels, I and my immediate staff moved into a small villa belonging to a French shipowner. Though the owner had fled, he had left his domestic staff in possession, so we found someone already installed who could run the house and look after its furniture and other contents. In contrast to what happened later in Germany, it did not occur to us to act as lords and masters who could do as they pleased with enemy property. On the contrary, a strict check was kept on houses occupied by German troops, and the removal of whole sets of furniture or the appropriation of valuables as souvenirs certainly had no place in the German army's code of behaviour. When out riding one day, I passed a villa that had been left in a state of pretty average confusion by the German unit recently in occupation. The very next morning, the sergeant major of the company concerned had to move in with a fatigue party and personally ensure that order was restored. As a result of the impeccable behaviour of our troops, nothing happened to disturb our relations with the civil population during my 6 months in France. The French, for all their politeness, maintained a dignified reserve which could only earn our respect. For the rest, I suppose everyone tended to fall under the spell of that blessed land, with its beautiful scenery and wealth of monuments to an ancient culture, to say nothing of the delights of a famous cuisine, and the things that were still to be had in the shops. Admittedly, our purchasing power was limited, as only a percentage of a man's pay was issued in occupation currency. This regulation was strictly enforced where the army was concerned, thereby imposing a check on the natural urge to go shopping, a thing most desirable for Wehrmacht prestige. Still, one had enough to make an occasional trip to Paris and pass the day savouring the charm of that city. Our stay on the coast enabled us to go bathing right up to the middle of November, a pleasure which my new aide, Lieutenant Specht, my faithful driver, Nagel, and my groom, Runge, enjoyed just as thoroughly as the opportunities for long gallops along the beach. On one occasion, however, we forgot about the unusual tides in the Channel, where there can be as much as 26 feet difference between high and low tide. This, incidentally, proved an extremely important factor, when the possibility of a landing on the English coast and the times of embarkation in the invasion harbours came under discussion. As a result, when we were already far out to sea, the waves suddenly started lapping round our Mercedes on the beach. Only in the very nick of time did we succeed in getting a tractor to tow it out of the incoming tide, through sand that had already turned very soft. But neither the joys and attractions of that beautiful country nor the period of rest after a successful campaign caused our troops to go soft, a fate to which occupation troops are usually exposed. Any tendency in that direction was counteracted by the need to train our formations for the projected invasion, a completely new task in itself. The troops had daily exercises in the dunes and neighbouring fenland, which in many respects resembled our intended landing places. After the arrival of our ferrying equipment, converted Rhine and Elbe barges, small trawlers and motorboats, we were able, in calm weather, to practice embarkation and disembarkation with the Navy. As often as not, when a landing craft beached clumsily, this spelt a cold bath for one or two of those taking part. The young midshipmen still had their own job to learn. One could not blame them for their lack of enthusiasm at having to command Elbe barges instead of serving on a smart cruiser or U-boat, particularly as it was not always easy to get along with the old salts who owned the barges and trawlers and stood beside them on the bridges of these rather fantastic invasion craft. Nevertheless, all personnel showed the utmost keenness in training for their unaccustomed task, and we were convinced that, like everything else, it could be mastered in due course. This seems to me to be a good place to include a few critical remarks on Hitler's invasion plan and the reasons that led him to abandon it. If Hitler really believed he had already won the war after the defeat of France, and that it was now merely a matter of bringing this home to Britain, he could not have been more wrong. The icy indifference of the British to his peace offer, which was anyway an extremely vague one, showed that neither the government nor the nation were open to persuasion. And so Hitler and OKW found themselves wondering, what next? Any statesman or supreme commander is liable to be faced with the same problem in wartime when an entirely new situation arises through a military setback or an unexpected development in the political field. The entry of another power into the war on the side of the enemy, for example. In such circumstances, he may have no choice but to throw the existing war plan overboard. At the same time, one may feel inclined to blame him for overestimating his own resources and underrating the enemy's, or for committing an error of political judgment. But when the head of a state or a war machine has to ask himself, what next, after his military operations have entirely fulfilled, or, as in this case, far exceeded, his expectations, leading to one enemy's defeat and causing the other to beat a retreat to his island fastness, one cannot help wondering whether such a thing as a war plan ever existed on the German side. Certainly no war goes off according to a firm programme set by one side or the other. But since Hitler accepted the risks of war with France and Britain in September 1939, it was his duty to consider beforehand how he should cope with these powers in various contingencies. It is quite obvious that prior to, or even during, the offensive in France, Germany's Supreme Command had no kind of war plan to determine what measures should be taken once the victories it hoped for had been won. Hitler's hope was that Britain would give in. As for his military advisers, they clearly felt obliged to await a Führer's decision. The above state of affairs strikingly exemplified the inevitable outcome of the inexpedient military roof organization that had emerged in Germany when Hitler assumed supreme command without creating a Reich Chief of Staff responsible for grand strategy. The plain fact is that next to the head of state who made the political decisions, there was no parallel military authority empowered to take responsibility for this overall strategy. From its very inception, Hitler had relegated OKW to the status of a military secretariat. In any case, its chief, Keitel, would not have been in the least capable of advising Hitler on strategy. As for the commanders-in-chief of the three armed services, Hitler allowed them practically no influence whatever on grand strategy. From time to time, they were able to express an opinion on policy matters at personal interviews, But ultimately, Hitler alone made the decisions on the basis of his own deliberations. So invariably did he insist on the right to initiate policy that, except in the case of Norway, where Raeder probably put up the first suggestion, I know of no instance in which a fundamental decision impinging on overall war policy can be placed to the credit of any of the three service staffs. Since no one, least of all OKW, was authorized to draft a war plan, the effect in practice was that everyone left things to the Führer's intuition. Some, like Keitel and Göring, did so in credulous adulation. Others, like Brauchitsch and Raeder, in a mood of resignation. The fact that all three service staffs certainly conducted their own internal studies of long-term policy made not a scrap of difference. As early as the winter of 1939–40, for example, Grand Admiral Raeder made the Naval Operations Staff examine the technical possibilities and requirements of a landing operation on the coast of England. There was still no military authority or personality in the sense of a real chief of the General Staff, whom Hitler was prepared to regard not only as an expert or executive, but also as being explicitly in charge of overall strategy. In the event, the result of this pattern of command was, as I have already stated, that when the campaign in the West was finished, we were confronted with the problem of what to do next. In addition to this, the German Supreme Command had two facts to contend with. First, the existence of an unbeaten Britain which was palpably unwilling to come to terms. Secondly, the danger of intervention by our new neighbour, the Soviet Union, however peace-loving it might be acting in the meantime. It was a threat which Hitler had indicated back in November 1939, when stressing the need to achieve a prompt decision in the West. In the light of these two facts, it was clear that the Reich's most pressing task must be to end the war with Britain at the earliest possible date. Only then could one hope that Stalin had finally missed his chance to exploit the discord of the European peoples for his own expansionist ends. If no way to an understanding could be found, Germany must try to rid herself of her last opponent, England, by force of arms. It is the tragedy of that brief period in which the fate of Europe was settled for so many years to come that neither side sought any means of coming to terms on a common-sense basis. What is certain is that Hitler would have preferred to avoid a life-and-death struggle with the British Empire because his real aims lay in the East. The way he put over his far too vague peace offer at the Reichstag session after the campaign in France, however, was hardly conducive to favourable reactions. Apart from that, it is open to doubt whether Hitler, already drunk with a belief in his own infallibility, would have been ready to accept a peace based on reason and justice, even if the opposing side had seriously suggested such a thing. What is more, he was now the prisoner of his own deeds. He had handed over half of Poland and the Baltic to the Soviet Union, an action he could reverse only at the cost of a new war. He had opened the way to Italy's covetous desire for territories under French sovereignty, and thereby landed himself in a state of dependency on his ally. Finally, since Prague, he had become untrustworthy in the eyes of the world and forfeited everyone's faith in whatever agreements he might subscribe to. For all that, the mass of the German people would have wildly acclaimed him had Hitler presented them with a reasonable negotiated peace after the defeat of France. They were not eager to incorporate tracts of predominantly Polish territory into the Reich, nor did they feel any sympathy for those who, still dreaming of a distant past, based their claims to these lands on the fact that they had once formed part of the Holy Roman Empire. The idea of a master race whom it behoved to dominate Europe, or even the whole world, was never taken seriously in Germany except by a few party fanatics. Hitler had only to whistle his pack of propaganda enthusiasts to heel, and the general approval for a reasonable peace would have been free to express itself. On the other hand, though, it may be that the British national character, so impressively incorporated in the person of Winston Churchill, prevented Britain from entertaining any serious thought of a rational settlement at that, or indeed any later stage of the war. There was that admirable tenacity of the British which impels them to go through with any struggle they have once embarked on, however threatening the situation of the moment may be. On top of this, in the bitterness of their unconditional hatred for Hitler and his regime, and for Prussianism too, in the case of several political leaders, came the inability to discern an even worse system and an even greater menace to Europe in the form of the Soviet Union. What also prejudiced British policy was the traditional striving for a European balance of power, the restoration of which had been Britain's ultimate motive for entering the war, since it demanded the defeat of a Germany which had become too powerful on the continent. British eyes were blind to the fact that the big need in a changed world would be to create a world balance of power in view of the might which the Soviet Union had attained, and the dangers inherent in its dedication to the idea of world revolution. In addition to all this, Churchill was probably too much of a fighter. His mind was too exclusively concerned with battle and ultimate victory to see beyond this military goal into the political future. Only several years later, when the Russians were approaching the Balkans, a neuralgic spot for Britain, did Churchill appreciate the danger of this development. By then, however, he could no longer get his way with Roosevelt and Stalin. Meanwhile, he relied on the vitality of his people and the ability of the American president eventually to bring the United States into the war on Britain's side, disinclined though the American people might have been at that stage, for all their dislike of Hitler, to see this happen. Furthermore, a man like Churchill was hardly going to overlook the latent danger which the Soviet Union represented for Germany. As far as the war was concerned, he booked it on the credit side for Britain. On the other hand, the idea of seeking a settlement with Germany on the premise that this would most probably be shortly followed by a struggle for power between the two totalitarian states appears to have found no place in his reasoning. This, despite the fact that a sober assessment of the strengths and weaknesses of the two powers would almost certainly have led him to deduce that neither could completely master the other, and that they were much more likely to tie each other down to their mutual debilitation for some time to come. Such a situation would automatically have cast the Anglo-Saxon powers as world umpires, to say nothing of the fact that the struggle between the two totalitarian states would probably have sealed the fate of their regimes. In an age of dictatorships, ideologies and crusades, an age in which the emotions of the masses are whipped up by unbridled propaganda, the word reason is, I fear, never spelt with a capital R. And so, to both people's detriment and Europe's misfortune, it turned out that neither Britain nor Germany could see any practical alternative but to fight it out. Thus, the German Supreme Command's answer to the problem of what to do after the end of the campaign in the West was to continue the struggle against Britain. But the fact that, for the reasons discussed above, no war plan extending beyond the campaign in the west of the continent had ever existed on the German side was to have grave consequences. When Hitler now conceived the plan, without actually making up his mind, to tackle Britain by invasion, no practical preparations whatever had been taken to this end. In consequence, we threw away our best chance of taking immediate advantage of Britain's weakness. The preparations that were only now put in train used up so much time that the success of any landing became doubtful for reasons of weather alone. This last fact, in addition to others to which we shall return in due course, gave Hitler his grounds, or rather his pretext, for dropping the invasion project and turning right away from Britain to strike at the Soviet Union. The outcome is well known. Before I deal with the reasons for this decisive change of front, I feel I should review the chances that would have existed had Hitler been ready to carry through the fight with Britain to the last. 3 methods would have been open to us. The first would have been to try to force Britain to her knees by cutting off her supply lines from overseas. Germany's prospects here were favourable to the extent that she now had full possession of the coasts of Norway, Holland, Belgium and France as bases for air and submarine warfare. The position regarding the resources to be used in this connection was less favourable. So far, the Navy had nothing remotely approaching an adequate number of U-boats, not to mention the heavy vessels, particularly aircraft carriers, which would have had to cooperate with them. In addition, it was seen that Britain's anti-submarine defences would retain the upper hand as long as we failed to put the RAF out of action. As for the Luftwaffe, the following are the tasks that would have devolved on it. To achieve mastery of the air, at least to the extent of eliminating the RAF's ability to combat submarine warfare. To paralyse the British ports. To cooperate effectively with the U-boats in their attacks on enemy shipping. In practice, all this amounted to overcoming the RAF and destroying its production centres. That the Luftwaffe was still not strong enough to attain this object in 1940 is shown by the Battle of Britain. Whether the outcome would have been the same if weather conditions had not been so unexpectedly unfavourable in August and September, and if the German command had not turned its attention from fighting the RAF to attacking London at what might well have been a critical time for the enemy, may be left undecided. At all events, it was impossible in the summer of 1940, in the light of the very limited number of German bombers available and the lack of long-range fighters, speedily to fulfill the aim of overpowering the RAF and destroying its production centres. Every battle that ever had to be fought out by sheer weight of material resources has always required more time and far more forces than were originally estimated. Quick decisions in battles between more or less equal opponents are usually reached only by superior leadership and seldom by a test of strength, as would have inevitably been the case here. We ought, therefore, to have prepared from the outset for a prolonged struggle. Just as the submarine fleet should first have been multiplied to guarantee success, so would similar steps have been necessary with regard to the Luftwaffe. The fact must also be faced that the idea of quickly bringing a country as large as Britain to its knees by strategic air warfare, as conceived by General Douay, was, in those days at any rate, still wishful thinking. The same thing may be said of the Allies' aerial warfare against the Reich later on. In any case, once it had been decided to force Britain to the ground by cutting off her maritime traffic, the whole of the Reich's war production should have been given over to building up German submarine and air strength. A reduction of the army to free manpower for industry would have been indispensable in this connection. The very length of the struggle constituted its danger. No one could know how long the Russians would stay quiet. A reduction in Germany's land forces and the commitment of her entire air power against England would enable the Soviet Union, even if it did not enter the war, at least to exert political blackmail. Another danger was the possibility that the Americans, who were hardly going to stand by and watch Britain slowly strangled, would intervene at an early stage. In a battle of air fleets and naval forces, they could have intervened relatively quickly, whereas if an actual German invasion of England had been taking place, they would certainly have come too late. Nevertheless, had the Reich had a real strategic policy, it would have been entirely conceivable that this course of action could have been taken with a prospect of success, always bearing in mind, of course, the danger of intervention by the Soviet Union or the United States, and certainly only provided that the aim of destroying the RAF and then cutting off Britain's supply lines at sea were strictly adhered to. Any digression into vague notions of striking at the morale of the enemy population by raids on the cities would only have endangered the chances of winning. The second possible way of bringing down Britain I will call the struggle for the Mediterranean. Hitler, and indeed the German military leadership as a whole, are reproached with having been incapable of breaking free from the continental way of thinking and of never having recognized the significance of the Mediterranean as the lifeline of the British Empire. It is true, perhaps, that Hitler thought only in terms of the continent. What is open to question, though, is whether, on the one hand, the loss of her position in the Mediterranean would really have compelled Britain to give up the fight, and, on the other, what consequences the conquest of the Mediterranean zone would have had for the Reich. It is indisputable that the loss of the Mediterranean would have been a serious blow for Britain. The possible effects with regard to India and the Near East, and thereby to oil supplies, might have been extremely grave. Furthermore, the final blocking of the sea to shipping would have substantially aggravated Britain's food problems. But would this blow have been lethal? To my mind, it would not. Britain would still have had her link with the Far and Middle East round the Cape of Good Hope, and this could in no event be cut, unless by a close blockade of the British Isles by the U-boats and Luftwaffe, in other words, by the aforementioned method. This, however, would have pinned down the Luftwaffe's entire resources, leaving nothing in hand for the Mediterranean. Painful though the loss of Gibraltar, Malta and her positions in Egypt and the Near East might well have been for Britain, it would certainly not have been fatal. Indeed, the British being as they are, it would presumably have served only to stiffen their national will. The British nation would have refused to accept these losses as final and would have gone on fighting all the more bitterly. In all probability, it would have given the lie to the slogan about the Mediterranean being the lifeline of the empire. It is also most unlikely that the dominions would have withdrawn their support. The second question is what consequences the critical struggle for the Mediterranean would have had for the Reich. The first point here is that though Italy might have made a good basis for operations, her armed forces could have provided only a very modest contribution to the contest. This did not need to be proved by events. It was already apparent. In particular, the Italian fleet could not have been expected to drive the British from the Mediterranean. The main burden of the struggle would thus have to be borne by Germany, who would not be helped by the fact that her ally regarded the Mediterranean as his private reserve and would accordingly lay claim to the overall command. If we were going to deprive Britain of her position in the Mediterranean, in the hope of dealing her a mortal blow, Malta and Gibraltar would have to be taken, and the British expelled from Egypt and Greece. There can hardly be any doubt that if Germany were to shift the focal point of her strategy to the Mediterranean, she would have had to solve this task in a military sense. But that would not have been the end of it. The capture of Gibraltar could only have been carried out either with Spanish consent, which was in fact never obtained, or by bringing pressure to bear on the Spaniards. Either course would have meant the end of Spanish neutrality. The Reich would have been left with no other choice than to take over, with or without the agreement of Madrid and Lisbon, the protection of the whole Iberian coastline, as well as to guarantee the supply of that area. Resistance could have been expected from both countries, most of all from Portugal, who would have seen her colonies immediately occupied by England. Anyhow, the Iberian Peninsula would have swallowed a considerable portion of the German army in the long run, and the repercussions in the USA and Latin America to a forcible occupation of Spain and Portugal could have been disastrous. If no real settlement were found with France, which was pretty well out of the question in view of the Italian and Spanish claims on her colonial territories, it would have ultimately become necessary to occupy French North Africa if a naval power like Britain were to be prevented from one day retrieving a footing in the Mediterranean. Once the British had been driven from Egypt, and from Greece too in the event of their moving in there, it seems likely that in the eastern Mediterranean the course of action considered here would inevitably have led on to the lands of the Near East, especially if one remembers that we should have needed to cut Britain's oil supplies. The view has been expressed that the creation of a base in the Near East would have offered Germany two advantages: one, the possibility of menacing India, and the other, a flank position against the Soviet Union to deter it from intervening against Germany. I feel these arguments are unrealistic. Quite apart from the questionable effect the establishment of German troops in their countries would have had on the Near Eastern peoples, there are two other aspects to bear in mind. Operations against India or the Soviet Union from the Near Eastern region could, for supply reasons alone, never have been executed on a scale guaranteeing real success. By virtue of being a naval power, Britain had the bigger pull here. The appearance of Germany in the Near East, far from dissuading the Soviet Union from action against Germany, would only have made her intervene all the sooner. The crux of this whole Mediterranean problem, to my mind, is as follows. Britain's loss of her positions there would hardly have sealed her fate. To go further, a decisive struggle for the mastery of the Mediterranean would ultimately have tied down such large German forces for so long that the temptation for the Soviet Union to come into the war against us would have increased beyond measure. This is all the more true if one considers that the spoils in which the Soviet Union might well have been interested, the Balkans and a dominating influence in the Near East, could henceforth have been won only by fighting it out with Germany. To strive for Britain's downfall by way of the Mediterranean would, in fact, have constituted a detour comparable with that taken by Napoleon when he set out to strike a mortal blow at Britain in India by way of Egypt. It was a course entailing the long-term commitment of Germany's forces in a direction that could not be decisive. More than that, it would have enabled the British motherland to rearm and at the same time given the Soviet Union its really big opening vis-à-vis the Reich. In point of fact, the Mediterranean method would have implied evading the decision we felt unable to achieve against the British motherland directly. This brings us to the third course at issue in 1940, that of an invasion of the island of Britain. Before we pass on to this, it should be noted with regard to our Mediterranean strategy in its practical outcome that, as so often happened later on in Russia, Hitler never made the right forces available at the right time. It was, in any case, a cardinal error on his part to refrain from attempting to take Malta, the capture of which would almost certainly have been feasible in the early stages. His failure to do so can reasonably be regarded as a factor of decisive importance in the ultimate loss of North Africa and all that followed in its train. At all events, in June 1940, Hitler conceived the plan of invading Britain, without, as I said, making any firm decision, and ordered the appropriate preparations to be started. The operation was to be prepared under the code name Celian, but was to be put into execution only after certain prior conditions had been fulfilled. The manner in which the execution was planned and the interminable disputes which resulted, primarily between the Army and Navy staffs, have already been dealt with by others. So have the reasons, or pretexts, which were finally to justify the abandonment of the project. All that will be done here, therefore, is to examine the three most important questions. Would an invasion of England have compelled her to give up the struggle, and would it, assuming that it had been successful, have finally decided the issue? Could an invasion really have been expected to succeed, and what would have been the consequences of its failure? What were the reasons that ultimately led Hitler to relinquish the plan, thereby giving up the idea of forcing an issue with Britain, and to turn against the Soviet Union? The answer to the first question is that an invasion would have been the quickest way to overpower Britain. The two other ways discussed above could not bring a quick decision. But would this one have been final? The answer must be that there was every possibility, even probability, that even after the fall of the island, the Churchill government would have tried to continue the fight from Canada. Whether the other dominions would have followed its lead cannot be told. Still, the conquest of the island itself still did not mean the complete defeat of the empire. Whether the British population, unlike the French, would have gone on resisting in the event of a successful invasion, or whether, as even Churchill has thought possible, a government would have been found to sign a capitulation, is a purely hypothetical question which cannot be discussed here. The same applies to whether, in the latter contingency, means could have been found, as in the case of Belgium in World War I, of feeding the British population. Author. The cardinal point must surely be this. The conquest of the island by Germany would have deprived the other side of the very base that was indispensable, in those days, at any rate, for a sea-borne assault on the continent of Europe. To launch an invasion from over the Atlantic without being able to use the island as a springboard was beyond the bounds of possibility in those days, even if the United States came into the war. And it can hardly be doubted that with Britain occupied, the RAF eliminated, the fleet banished across the Atlantic, and the island's war potential rendered nugatory, Germany would have been able to deal with the situation in the Mediterranean without further ado. It must be stated, then, that even if the British government had tried to fight on after the loss of the motherland, it would have had little further prospect of winning. Would the Dominions have continued to give their support in such circumstances? Would the Soviet Union's latent threat to the Reich have been of any further consequence had the Russians no longer been able to count on a second front in the foreseeable future? Would not Stalin's reaction to this have been to turn his attentions, with Hitler's agreement, to Asia? Would the United States have undertaken their crusade against the Reich had they known they must bear the brunt of the cost alone? No conclusive answers to these questions can be found today, nor could they be found at the time. Admittedly, the Reich would have been just as unable to impose peace across the seas. Yet one thing is certain. Its position following a successful invasion of Britain would have been an incomparably happier one than any to be found along the road taken by Hitler. From the military point of view then, an invasion of Britain in the summer of 1940, provided it offered a prospect of success, would undoubtedly have been the right solution. What steps should or could have been taken in the event of a German victory in order to bring about the negotiated peace, which should always have been the aim of a rational German policy, is outside the scope of this military study. Let us rather turn to the military aspects again and seek to determine whether an invasion of Britain in 1940 would have had any chance of succeeding. Opinions on this score will, I suppose, always remain divided. Selion certainly involved tremendous risks. Nevertheless, it is not enough to point to the vast amount of technical equipment required by the Allies for their invasion in 1944 in order to prove that a German invasion dependent on infinitely more primitive ferrying gear would have inevitably miscarried. Neither is it enough to refer to the Allies' absolute supremacy in the air and at sea in 1944, decisive though it was in both cases. While Germany had none of these things to her credit in the summer of 1940, she had, on the other hand, the decisive advantage of not initially having to face any organised defence of the British coastline in the form of troops that were adequately armed, trained and led. It is a fact that as far as her land forces went in summer 1940, Britain was to a large extent defenceless. Her defencelessness would have been well nigh complete had Hitler not allowed the BEF to escape from Dunkirk. The success of an invasion of England in the summer of 1940 depended on two factors: execution at the earliest possible date, so that we could hit Britain while she was still undefended and take advantage of the summer weather. In our own experience, the Channel was almost invariably as calm as a mill pond in July and August, and at the beginning of September. Our ability to neutralise the RAF and British fleet in the Channel area for the duration of the crossing and the period immediately following it. At the same time, it is true that, with our uncertainty regarding the weather and the Luftwaffe's ability to gain air superiority over the Channel to at least the extent demanded, Selion was bound to involve very big risks. In the light of these risks, the responsible Wehrmacht staffs probably did go about the operation with some hesitation and various mental reservations. That Hitler's own heart was not in it was clear even then. At all levels, the preparations lacked that driving force from the top which was usually so apparent. General Jodl, chief of the Combined Services Operations Staff, regarded any attempt at invasion as an act of desperation quite unwarranted by the situation as a whole. The Commander-in-Chief of the Luftwaffe, Göring, whom the High Command had as usual failed to keep firmly in check, in no way regarded his air offensive against Britain as an integral part, vital though it was, of a concerted invasion undertaken by the Wehrmacht. On the contrary, the way he committed and ultimately squandered the Luftwaffe's resources points to his having regarded the air offensive against the island as a self-contained operation, which he conducted accordingly. The Naval High Command, which had been the first authority to raise the question of an invasion of Britain, had at least concluded from its study of the practical problems involved that the operation would be feasible provided certain advance requirements were met. Despite this, it was probably more strongly affected than anyone else by its awareness of the inadequacy of its equipment. The body taking the most positive view was undoubtedly the High Command of the Army, although it does not seem to have contemplated the idea of an invasion prior to the fall of France. One thing is certain. Those who stood to risk their necks first and foremost if Selion were put into execution, the army formations earmarked to take part, were the very ones to display the greatest energy and assurance in their pursuit of the preparations. I feel entitled to say this because the formation under my own command, 38 Corps, was designed to go over in the first wave from between Boulogne and Etaples to the stretch of coast running from Bexhill to Beachy Head. Without underrating the dangers, we were confident of success. At the same time, we may not have been sufficiently aware of the misgivings of the two other services, especially the Navy. It is well known that Hitler had two reasons, or pretexts, for finally dropping the Selian plan. One was the fact that the preparations took so long that the first wave could not have crossed till 24th September at the earliest. This was a date by which it would no longer be possible, even assuming that the first wave succeeded, to count on the continuing stretch of fine weather necessary for the follow-up. The second and really decisive reason is the fact that even by this date the Luftwaffe had not attained the requisite air supremacy over British territory. Even if these two facts are accepted as having in September 1940 been grounds for calling off the invasion, that still does not establish whether a German invasion would not have been possible had the German command handled matters differently. This, however, must be the whole basis of any appraisal of Hitler's decision to avoid a fight to the death with Britain in order to turn on the Soviet Union. The problem is whether the two above-mentioned facts, the delay over the launching of Selian and the inconclusive state of the Battle of Britain, were inevitable or not. As far as the first is concerned, the postponement of the landing date till the end of September, this could most certainly have been avoided. The existence of a war plan focused on the problem of defeating Britain would have meant that a considerable part of the technical preparations for the invasion could have been tackled while the campaign in the West was still in progress. The existence of such a plan would have made it unthinkable for Hitler, whatever his motives, to allow the BEF to escape from Dunkirk. At its worst, the landing date would not have been retarded until well into the autumn had the German decision to invade Britain been taken at least at the time of the fall of France, that is, in mid-June, and not a whole month later, in mid-July. The invasion preparations, carried out as they were in pursuance of the order issued in July, and within the limits of what was humanly possible at the time, were completed by the middle of September. A decision 4 weeks earlier would thus have made it possible to cross the Channel by the middle of August. As for the unsatisfactory progress of the Battle of Britain that formed the second reason for the abandonment of Selion, the following points come to mind. The idea of gaining air supremacy over Britain by dint of an isolated aerial war commencing weeks in advance of the earliest possible invasion date was an error of leadership. By gaining air supremacy over Britain before the invasion took place, it was proposed to guarantee the success of the latter. All this achieved in the event was a premature dissipation of the Luftwaffe's strength in a battle fought under unfavourable conditions. A sober assessment of its own strength in relation to the enemy's should at least have given the Luftwaffe staff strong doubts whether its own forces were adequate or suitable to carry the action against the RAF and its production centres to a decisive conclusion above Britain herself. First of all, the Luftwaffe leadership underrated the strength of fighter command and overestimated the effect of its own bombers, besides allowing itself to be surprised by the existence of an efficient radar system on the other side. In addition, the range and penetration zone of the bombers, and even more so that of the fighters, were known to be below what was required. As a result, the RAF was able to dodge the annihilating blows that were aimed at it. Quite apart from this, the German fighters over England invariably had to operate under less favourable conditions than their opponents. The bombers, for their own part, had in a great number of cases to manage without proper fighter cover as soon as they outranged their escorts. This consideration alone should have decided the Luftwaffe command against starting a showdown with the RAF, until the latter were compelled to join battle under similar conditions, i.e. over the Channel or its coastlines, in immediate operational conjunction with the actual invasion. Finally, the German command committed the further error of altering the operational target of its air offensive at the very moment when, despite the Luftwaffe's handicaps, some foreseeable, some unexpected, vis-à-vis the RAF, the outcome was actually in the balance. On 7th September, the main weight of the attacks was shifted to London, a target which no longer had any operational bearing on the invasion preparations. Desirable though the attainment of air supremacy prior to the invasion always was, a careful review of all the factors involved should still have prompted the German Supreme Command to commit the Luftwaffe for its decisive blow only in immediate conjunction with the invasion. One can, of course, object that on this basis the Luftwaffe's resources would have been called upon to perform too many tasks, namely to attack British air bases in the south of England, to cover the embarkation in the French harbours, to protect the transports as they crossed the Channel, to support the first wave of invasion troops during their landing, and, in cooperation with the Navy and coastal artillery, to prevent the British fleet from interfering. But not all these tasks would have been simultaneous, even if they had to be solved in close succession. For example, the British fleet, apart from the light naval forces stationed in harbours in the south of England, could probably not have intervened until after the first wave of troops had landed. Everything would have depended on the outcome of a big aerial battle, which would have started over the Channel or southern England as soon as the army and navy began invading. The conditions experienced by the Luftwaffe in this battle would nevertheless have been immeasurably more favourable than in its raids on the interior of the country. Naturally, such a mode of action meant staking everything on one card. That, however, would have been the price one was bound to pay in the circumstances if the invasion were to be risked at all. When Hitler, for the above-mentioned reasons, virtually discarded the plan for an invasion of England in September 1940, these reasons may indeed have been cogent enough at the time. The fact that they could emerge at all was due to the absence of any authority inside the German Supreme Command, except for Hitler the politician, that was responsible for overall strategic policy. There was no authority that could in good time have worked out a war plan to include Britain and been capable of effectively directing the invasion as a unified operation of all three services. If the German command thus cast away its chances of fighting the final bout with Britain to a successful conclusion, the reasons are to be sought not only in the shortcomings of the staff organisation, but substantially in Hitler's political thinking. Here can hardly be any doubt that Hitler always wished to avoid a contest with Britain and the British Empire. He stated often enough that it could never be in the Reich's interest to destroy the empire. He admired this empire as a political achievement. Even if one is unwilling to take such utterances at their face value, one thing at least is certain. Hitler knew that if the British Empire were destroyed, not he or Germany could be its heir, but the United States, Japan, or the Soviet Union. Seen in this realistic perspective, his attitude to Britain does at least make sense. He had neither wanted nor expected war with Britain. Consequently, he wished to avoid a showdown with her for as long as was possible. This attitude, and doubtless also the fact that he had not expected such a staggering victory over France, explain Hitler's failure to adopt a war plan which aimed at defeating Britain too, once France was overthrown. The point is that he did not want to land in Britain. His political concept was at odds with the strategic requirements that followed from the victory in the West. The disastrous part of it was that this concept of his encountered no sympathy in Britain. Hitler's attitude towards the Soviet Union, on the other hand, was fundamentally different, despite the alliance he entered into with Stalin in 1939. He at once mistrusted and underrated the Russians. He feared their traditional urge for expansion, though he himself had opened the way to it in the West by signing the Moscow Pact. One may assume that Hitler knew the two totalitarian powers were bound to clash sooner or later after becoming next-door neighbours. Furthermore, he was forever preoccupied with Lebensraum, the living space he felt obliged to secure for the German people. It was something he could find only in the East. Though there was nothing about either of these lines of reasoning to prevent the ultimate clash with the Soviet Union from being put off until some later date, they were bound to acquire a special urgency for a man like Hitler when, after France's downfall, he seemed virtually the master of Europe. His feelings were reinforced by the menacing build-up of Soviet troops on Germany's eastern frontier, a trend which must in any event have given rise to misgivings about the Kremlin's future policies. Hitler now faced the problem of invading England. He was aware of the high degree of risk such an undertaking then involved. If the invasion were to fail, the army and navy forces taking part would be forfeit, and even the Luftwaffe would emerge very much weakened. At the same time, the failure of an invasion attempt would not, from the strictly military point of view, have irreparably impaired German military power. The more far-reaching effect would have been in the political field. On the one hand, through the Philip, any failure would have given to the determination of the British to go on with the war. On the other, its impact on the attitudes of the United States and the Soviet Union. Most of all, though, a spectacular military failure of this kind would have gravely damaged the dictator's prestige, both in Germany and the world as a whole. This was the one danger the dictator could not afford to run. Just as his general attitude towards the British Empire had always made him put any thought of a showdown behind him, and just as his false appraisal of the British mind had encouraged him to hope that it would still be possible to come to terms in the end, so did he now recoil from taking the risk. He wanted to evade the hazard of a decisive struggle with Britain. Instead of destroying her as a power, he thought he could convince her of the need for settlement by trying, as he himself put it, to strike from her hand the last sword she might hope to point at Germany on the mainland of Europe. But by thus recoiling from what was admittedly a pretty considerable military and political risk, Hitler committed his big error of judgment. For one thing was certain. If Hitler jibbed at fighting the battle with Britain in the hour most favourable to himself, Germany must sooner or later land in an untenable situation. The longer the war with Britain dragged on, the greater the danger threatening the Reich in the east must become. When Hitler did not venture to strike the decisive blow at Britain in the summer of 1940, and missed his unique chance of doing so, he could no longer play at seeing how long he could hold his breath. It was at this point that he was forced to venture the attempt to eliminate the Soviet Union by a preventive war while there was still no enemy in the West capable of menacing him on the continent. In reality, this meant that because of his aversion to the risk of invading Britain, Hitler took on the far greater risk of a war on two fronts. At the same time, by taking so long over and finally discarding the invasion plan, he wasted a year which should have brought Germany the final decision. It was a delay Germany could never make good. With the cancellation of Sealion at the end of September, 38th Corps went back to normal training. The ferrying equipment that had been assembled for us was withdrawn from the Channel harbours, already imperilled by RAF raids. Nothing was heard at this stage of Hitler's intentions regarding the Soviet Union, his final decision to attack it being taken much later. The first hints of what was to come did not reach me till the spring of 1941, when I was given a new appointment. At the end of February 1941, I handed over command of 38 Corps on the Channel coast in order to take over 56 Panzer Corps, whose headquarters were about to be set up in Germany. For me, this fulfilled a wish I had cherished even before the campaign in the West, to command a mechanized army corps. As a corps commander, of course, I was not consulted on the advisability and method of conducting a campaign against the Soviet Union. Our own operation order was not received until a very late stage, in May 1941, as far as I remember, and even then it covered only the immediate commitments of the Panzer Group to which my corps belonged. Thus, as far as the actual conduct of operations against the Soviet Union in 1941 is concerned, I cannot comment to anything like the extent I have done regarding the Western campaign, where I had personally influenced the final shaping of the operations plan. However, I think two factors may be said to have become generally apparent since then. The first was the mistake committed by Hitler, if by no one else, of underrating the resources of the Soviet Union and the fighting qualities of the Red Army. In consequence, he based everything on the assumption that the Soviet Union could be overthrown by military means in one campaign. Had this even been possible, it could have been achieved only by bringing about the Soviet Union's simultaneous collapse from within. Yet the policies which Hitler, in complete negation of the efforts of the military authorities, pursued through his Reich, Commissioners and Security Service, SD, in the occupied territories of the East, were bound to achieve the very opposite effect. In other words, while his strategic policy was to demolish the Soviet system with the utmost dispatch, his political actions were diametrically opposed to this. Differences between the aims of the political and military leaders have often arisen in other wars. In this case, with the military and political leadership united in Hitler's hands, the result was that his political measures in the East ran entirely counter to the requirements of his strategy, depriving it of whatever chance it may have had of a speedy victory. The second factor was the failure to achieve a uniform strategic policy at the summit, i.e., between Hitler and OKH. This applied both to the planning of the overall operation and to its execution in the campaign of 1941. Hitler's strategic aims were based primarily on political and economic considerations. These were the capture of Leningrad, a city he regarded as the cradle of Bolshevism, by which he proposed to join up with the Finns and dominate the Baltic, and possession of the raw material regions of the Ukraine, the armaments centres of the Donets Basin, and later the Caucasus oil fields. By seizing these territories, he hoped to cripple the Soviet war economy completely. OKH, on the other hand, rightly contended that the conquest and retention of these undoubtedly important strategic areas depended on first defeating the Red Army. The main body of the latter, they argued, would be met on the road to Moscow, since that city, as the focal point of Soviet power, was one whose loss the regime dare not risk. This appreciation was subsequently not fully confirmed by the actual distribution of the Soviet forces. Author. There were three reasons for this. One was that, in contrast to 1812, Moscow really did form the political centre of Russia. Another was that the loss of the armaments areas around and east of Moscow would at least inflict extensive damage on the Soviet war economy. The third and possibly most important reason from the strategic point of view was Moscow's position as the nodal point of European Russia's traffic network. Its loss would split the Russian defences in two and prevent the Soviet command from ever mounting a single coordinated operation. Viewed strategically, the divergence of views between Hitler and OKH amounted to this. Hitler wanted to seek the issue on both wings, a solution for which, in view of the relative strengths involved and the vastness of the theatre of operations, Germany did not possess adequate forces, whereas OKH sought it in the centre of the front. It was on this divergence of basic strategy that the German conduct of operations ultimately foundered. Although Hitler agreed to the distribution of forces proposed by OKH, according to which the bulk of the army was to be committed in two army groups in the north, and only one in the area south of the Pripyat marshes, the tug-of-war over strategic objectives continued throughout this campaign. The inevitable consequence was that Hitler not only failed to attain his aims, which were too far-flung anyway, but also confused the issue for OKH. The general intention laid down by Hitler in his Barbarossa directive, destruction of the bulk of the Russian army located in western Russia by bold operations involving deep penetration by armoured spearheads, prevention of the withdrawal of battle-worthy elements into the Russian interior, was in the last analysis nothing more than a strategic or even tactical formula. Admittedly, thanks to the superiority of German staff work and the performance of the combat troops, we achieved extraordinary successes that brought the Soviet armed forces to the very brink of defeat. But this formula could never replace an operations plan over whose preparation and execution there should have been complete unanimity at the top, and which, in view of the relative strengths of the opposing armies and the tremendous distances involved, accepted the premise that it might take two campaigns to destroy the Soviet armed forces. In my capacity as a corps commander, however, I was not, as I have already said, briefed on the plans and intentions of the Supreme Command. For this reason, I had no suspicion at the time of the momentous differences of a strategic nature existing between Hitler and OKH. Yet even at this level, I soon began to feel their effect. 56. Panzer Corps was to attack from East Prussia as part of 4th Panzer Group of Northern Army Group. Northern Army Group, Field Marshal Ritter Veerslieb, was assigned the task of driving forward from East Prussia to destroy the enemy's forces in the Baltic territories and then to advance on Leningrad. The task of 4th Panzer Group, Colonel General Hübner in this connection, was to thrust forward to the Dwina opposite and below Dvinsk, Dunaburg, in order to seize all crossing points for a further advance in the direction of Opochka. On the right of 4th Panzer Group, 16th Army, Colonel General Busch, had to advance through Kovno, Kaunas. On the left, 18th Army, General Via Kuchler, was to move in the general direction of Riga. I arrived in 56 Panzer Corps Assembly Area on 16th of June. Colonel General Hübner had issued the following orders for the advance of 4th Panzer Group: 56 Panzer Corps, 8 Panzer Division, 3 Motorized Infantry Division and 290 Infantry Division was to break out in an easterly direction from the forest area north of the Memel and east of Tilsit, and to gain the big road to Dvinsk northeast of Kovno. To its left, 41 Panzer Corps, General Reinhardt, 1 and 6 Panzer Divisions, 36 Motorized Infantry Division and 269 Infantry Division, was to advance towards the Dwina crossing at Jakobstadt. The SS Death's Head Division, also belonging to the Panzer Group, would initially follow along behind, with a view to being sent in behind the corps, making the fastest progress. For the purpose both of cutting off all enemy forces forward of the Dwina and of forging ahead with Northern Army Group's operation, it was of decisive importance that the Dwina bridges should be captured intact, since this mighty river presented a formidable obstacle. The advance of 4th Panzer Group would thus be a race to see which of the two corps could reach the Dwina first. 56 Panzer Corps was determined to be the winner, its advantage being that in the light of the available information it stood to encounter less resistance in the enemy rear than 41 Panzer Corps. For this very reason, the latter had been given 1 armoured division more than our own corps. My suggestion that it would be better to make our main effort where we hoped to find the enemy weakest received no support from Panzer Group HQ. Before I describe the operations of 56 Panzer Corps, which are really conspicuous only for the fact that they were to develop into a panzer drive in the truest sense, some attention must be given to a matter which threw a revealing light on the gulf between soldiers' standards and those of our political leadership. A few days before the offensive started, we received an order from the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, OKW, which has since become known as the Commissar Order. The gist of it was that all political commissars of the Red Army whom we captured were to be shot out of hand as exponents of Bolshevik ideology. Now, I agree that from the point of view of international law, the status of these political commissars was extremely equivocal. They were certainly not soldiers, any more than I would have considered a Gauleiter attached to me as a political overseer to be a soldier. Neither could they be granted the same non-combatant status as chaplains, medical personnel, or war correspondents. On the contrary, they were, without being soldiers, fanatical fighters, but fighters whose activities could only be regarded as illegal according to the traditional meaning of warfare. Their task was not only the political supervision of Soviet military leaders, but even more, to instill the greatest possible degree of cruelty into the fighting, and to give it a character completely at variance with the traditional conceptions of soldierly behaviour. These same commissars were the men primarily responsible for the fighting methods and treatment of prisoners, which clashed so blatantly with the provisions of the Hague Convention on Land Warfare. Whatever one might feel about the status of commissars in international law, however, it inevitably went against the grain of any soldier to shoot them down when they had been captured in battle. An order like the Kommissarbefehl was utterly unsoldierly. To have carried it out would have threatened not only the honour of our fighting troops, but also their morale. Consequently, I had no alternative but to inform my superiors that the Commissar order would not be implemented by anyone under my command. My subordinate commanders were entirely at one with me in this, and everyone in the corps area acted accordingly. I need hardly add that my military superiors endorsed my attitude. It was only very much later, however, that all the efforts to get the Commissar order rescinded were ultimately successful, when it had become clear, namely, that the order simply incited the Commissars to resort to the most brutal methods to make their units fight on to the end. The fact that the rest of the army probably shared my view became apparent when I took command of 11th Army. The Commissar order had not been carried out there either. The few commissars who were shot in spite of this had not been captured in action, but picked up in the rear areas and sentenced as either the leaders or organisers of partisans' groups. Their cases were handled in accordance with military law. Author. At 1300 hours on 21st June, our HQ was notified that the offensive would begin at 0300 the following morning. The die was cast. Because of the restricted space allotted to my corps in the forest area north of the Memel, it was only possible to use 8 Panzer Division and 290 Infantry Division in the assault on the enemy frontier positions, which had been found to be occupied. For the time being, 3 motorized infantry division was kept south of the river. In the immediate vicinity of the frontier, we initially met with only weak resistance, probably from forward defended localities. Very soon, however, a hold-up was caused by a well-prepared pillbox system that was overcome only after 8 Panzer Division had broken through the enemy fortifications north of the Memel around noon. On this very first day, the Soviet command showed its true face. Our troops came across a German patrol which had been cut off by the enemy earlier on. All its members were dead and gruesomely mutilated. My ADC and I, who often had to pass through sectors of the front that had not been cleared of the enemy, agreed that we would never let an adversary like this capture us alive. Later on, there were more than enough cases where Soviet soldiers, after throwing up their hands as if to surrender, reached for their arms as soon as our infantry came near enough, or where Soviet wounded feigned death and then fired on our troops when their backs were turned. It was our general impression that while those of the enemy in front-line areas were in no way surprised by our attack, the Soviet military command had probably not been expecting it, or not for a while anyway, and for that reason never got as far as committing its powerful reserves in any coordinated form. There has been a great deal of argument as to whether the Soviet troop dispositions were actually defensive or offensive in character. If one went by the strength of the forces assembled in the western parts of the Soviet Union and the powerful concentration of armour in the Bialystok area and around Lwów, it was possible to contend, as Hitler did in support of his decision to attack, that sooner or later the Soviet Union would take the offensive. On the other hand, the layout of the Soviet forces on 22nd June 1941 did not indicate any immediate intention of aggression on the part of the Soviet Union. I think it would be nearest the truth to describe the Soviet dispositions, to which the occupation of eastern Poland, Bessarabia and the Baltic territories had already contributed very strong forces, as a deployment against every contingency. On 22nd June 1941, undoubtedly, the Soviet Union's forces were still strung out in such depth that they could then have been used only in a defensive role. Yet the pattern could have been switched in no time to meet any change in Germany's political or military situation. With a minimum of delay, the Red Army, each of whose army groups was numerically, if not qualitatively, superior to the German army group facing it, could have closed up and become capable of going over to the attack. Thus, the Soviet dispositions did in fact constitute a latent threat, even though they remained formally defensive up to 22nd June. The moment the Soviet Union had been offered a favourable opportunity, military or political, it could have become a direct menace to the Reich. Certainly Stalin would have preferred to avoid a clash with the Reich in summer 1941. But had international developments sooner or later led the Soviet leadership to believe that it could resort to political pressure, or even to the threat of military intervention against Germany, its provisionally defensive deployment could swiftly have taken on an offensive character. It was, precisely as I have said, a deployment against every contingency. And now let us return to 56 Corps. If the Corps were to fulfill its task of seizing the Dvinsk crossings intact, it had to concentrate on two things. On the very first day, it had to thrust 50 miles into enemy territory in order to capture the crossing over the Dubisa at Iragola. I knew the Dubisa sector from World War I. What we should find there was a deep, ravined valley whose slopes no tank could negotiate. In the First War, our railway engineers had laboured there for months on end to span the gap with a masterly construction of timber. If the enemy now succeeded in blowing up the big road viaduct at Iragola, the Corps would be hopelessly stuck, and the enemy would have time on the steep far bank of the river to organise a defence which would in any case be extremely difficult to penetrate. That we could thereafter no longer expect to make a surprise descent on the Dvinsk bridges was perfectly obvious. The Iragola crossing was indispensable to us as a springboard. Excessive though Corps HQ's requirements may appear to have been, 8th Panzer Division, General Brandenberger, with which I spent most of the day, still fulfilled its task. After breaking through the frontier positions and overrunning all enemy resistance further back, it seized the Iragola crossing with a reconnaissance force by the evening of 22nd June. 290 Division followed, marching at record speed, and 3 motorised Infantry Division, which had started moving over the Memel at noon, was directed towards a crossing south of Iragola. The first step had succeeded. The second condition for success at Dvinsk was that the Corps should push straight through to that town, regardless of whether the formations on its flanks kept abreast or not. The capture of those precious bridges depended entirely on our being able to take the enemy there completely by surprise. Naturally, we were fully aware that this course of action involved considerable risks. As it turned out, and as we had hoped, the Corps had the good fortune to strike a weak patch in the enemy's defences. Despite repeated enemy counterattacks, some of which entailed hard fighting, the divisions were able to break this resistance relatively quickly. While on our left, 41 Panzer Corps was temporarily held up by a strong enemy grouping dug in around Sialiai, Shaolin, and on our right, the left wing of 16th Army was fighting for Kovno. 56 Panzer Corps actually reached the Dvinsk highway by 24th of June in the area of Vilkomierz. Already 105 miles deep into enemy territory, it had not only outdistanced the German formations on either flank, but had also left the Soviet forces in the frontier zone far behind it. Now there were a bare 80 miles to go to reach the coveted bridges at Dvinsk. But could we maintain the pace? The enemy was certain to throw in fresh reserves against us. At any moment, moreover, he was liable, at any rate temporarily, to patch up the breach behind us and cut off our supplies. But in spite of warnings from Panzer Group HQ, we had no intention of letting the goddess of fortune elude us as a result of overcautiousness on our part. Though 290 Infantry Division had naturally been unable to keep up with the rest of the Corps, the fact that it was following in our train gave us a certain safeguard, particularly as it had already drawn the attention of strong enemy forces that would otherwise have attacked us in the rear. Meanwhile, Corps HQ and the 2 mobile divisions, 8 Panzer moving up the highway, and 3 motorised division, with rather more difficulty, along byways to the south of this, were striking out for the victory prize of Dvinsk. Both divisions were able to smash the enemy reserves thrown in to meet them. In these battles, some of which were extremely fierce, the enemy lost 70 tanks, about half the strength of our own armour, and numerous batteries. At this stage we had hardly the time or the men to spare for rounding up prisoners. Early on 26th of June 8th, Panzer Division was outside Dvinsk, and at 800 hours I was handed a report at its divisional headquarters that our dash to capture the 2 big bridges had succeeded. Fighting was still going on in the town on the far side of the river, but the big road bridge had fallen into our hands completely intact. The sentries detailed to set off the demolition charges had been overrun a few yards from the entrance. The railway bridge had been only slightly damaged by a small explosion and was still fit for use. The following day, 3rd Motorised Infantry Division pulled off a surprise crossing of the river upstream from the town. Our aim was achieved. Before the offensive started, I had been asked how long we thought we should take to reach Dvinsk, assuming that it was possible to do so. My answer had been that if it could not be done inside 4 days, we could hardly count on capturing the crossings intact. And now, exactly 4 days and 5 hours after 0 hour, we had actually completed, as the crow flies, a non-stop dash through 200 miles of enemy territory. We had brought it off only because the name of Dvinsk had been foremost in the mind of every officer and man, and because we had been ready to face heavy risks to reach our appointed goal. It gave us a tremendous feeling of achievement to drive over the big bridges into the town, despite the fact that the enemy had set most of it on fire before pulling out. It was an added satisfaction to know that we had not had to pay too high a price. Naturally, the Corps' position, if only on the northern bank of the Dvina, was anything but secure. 41. Panzer Corps and the left wing of 16th Army lay from 60 to 100 miles behind us. Between them and ourselves were several Soviet Army Corps, now withdrawing to the Dvina. Not only must we expect the enemy to do everything in his power to assail us on the northern bank, we also had to cover ourselves on the southern bank against those enemy formations approaching from the south. The precariousness of our position became further apparent when the Corps Q branch was attacked from the rear in a wood not far from my own tactical headquarters. However, we were less exercised by our present rather isolated position, which would not continue indefinitely, than by the problem of what the next move should be. Was the objective to be Leningrad, or should we turn towards Moscow? The Panzer Group commander, who flew over to see us in a Fieseler Storch on 27th of June, could tell us nothing. One might reasonably have expected the commander of a whole panzer group to be in the picture about future objectives, but this was obviously not the case. Instead, our enthusiasm was damped by an order to widen the bridgehead around Dvinsk and keep the crossings open. We were to wait for 41 Panzer Corps and the left wing of 16th Army to move up, the former having been directed to cross the river at Jakobstadt. While this was certainly the safe Staff College solution, we had had other ideas. As we saw it, our sudden appearance so far behind the front must have caused considerable confusion among the enemy. He would obviously make every attempt to throw us back across the river, fetching in troops from any quarter to do so. The sooner we pushed on, therefore, the less chance he would have of offering us any systematic opposition with superior forces. If we drove on towards Pskov, while of course continuing to safeguard the Dvina crossings, and if at the same time Panzer Group HQ pushed the other Panzer Corps straight through Dvinsk behind us, it seemed likely that the enemy would have to keep on opposing us with whatever forces he happened to have on hand at the moment, and be incapable for the time being of fighting a set battle. As for the beaten enemy forces south of the Dvina, these could be left to the infantry armies coming up behind. It goes without saying that the further a single Panzer Corps, or indeed the entire Panzer Group, ventured into the depths of the Russian hinterland, the greater the hazards became. Against this, it may be said that the safety of a tank formation operating in the enemy's rear largely depends on its ability to keep moving. Once it comes to a halt, it will immediately be assailed from all sides by the enemy's reserves. But the Supreme Command did not share our view, and for this it certainly cannot be blamed. We should, after all, have been tempting fortune more than somewhat had we tried to hold on to her coat sleeve any longer, for there was always the possibility from now on that she would lead us over a precipice. And so, for the immediate future, the goal of Leningrad receded into the distance as far as we were concerned, leaving us to mark time at Dvinsk. As we had anticipated, the enemy was now moving up reinforcements, not only from Pskov, but from Minsk and Moscow as well. Before long we were having our work cut out to beat off the attacks he launched on the northern bank of the Dvina with an armoured division in support, and at a number of points the position became quite critical. In the course of a counter-attack made by 3 Panzer Division to recover some temporarily abandoned ground, our troops found the bodies of 3 officers and 30 men who had lain wounded in a field dressing station captured by the enemy the previous day. Their mutilations were indescribable. In the next few days, the Soviet Air Force did everything possible to destroy the bridges which had been allowed to fall into our hands. With an almost mulish obstinacy, one squadron after another flew in at treetop level, only to be shot down by our fighters or flak. On one day alone, they lost 64 aircraft in this way. Finally, on 2nd July, we were able to move off again, after the SS Death's Head Division had joined the Corps as its third mobile formation, and 41 Panzer Corps had crossed the Dvina at Jakobstadt. For its further advance, 4th Panzer Group had been allotted the axis Rezekne-Ostrov-Pskov, so Leningrad now beckoned after all. Nevertheless, 6 days had elapsed since the Corps' surprise dash to Dvinsk. The enemy had had time to recover from the shock it must have given him to be suddenly confronted by German units on the northern bank of the Dvina. A tank drive such as 56 Panzer Corps made to Dvinsk inevitably generates confusion and panic in the enemy's communications zone. It ruptures the enemy's chain of command and makes it virtually impossible for him to coordinate his countermeasures. These advantages had now been waived as a result of 4th Panzer Group's decision, however commendable its motives, to consolidate on the Dvina. Whether we should now be fortunate enough to fully regain that lead over the enemy was doubtful, to say the least. Certainly the only chance of doing so lay in the Panzer Group's being able to bring its forces into action as an integrated whole. As will be seen, however, this is precisely what it failed to do, even though the enemy's resistance remained insufficient to halt the advance. To begin with, however, the Panzer Group moved off uniformly enough from the line Dvinsk, Jakobstadt in the direction of Pskov, 56 Panzer Corps proceeding along and to the east of the main road, Dvinsk-Rezekne-Ostrov-Pskov, and 41 Panzer Corps to its left. The enemy's resistance proved tougher and more methodical than in the first few days of the campaign, but he was still being outfought over and over again. The Panzer Group was now approaching the Stalin Line, a fortification which ran, in varying strength, along the original Soviet frontier from the southern extremity of Lake Peipus, west of Pskov, to what had once been the small Russian frontier fortress of Zibash. At this stage, Panzer Group HQ allocated the main road to 41 Panzer Corps to continue advancing on Ostrov, and swung 56 Panzer Corps hard east towards Zibash and Opochka. The intention was that we should break through the Stalin Line and outflank from the east a strong force of enemy armour believed to be based on Pskov. It was an excellent scheme if the force really existed, and 56 Panzer Corps were able to execute the manoeuvre with any speed. In our opinion, however, the former was not the case and the latter was not feasible, since in the direction it had been ordered to take, the Corps had to negotiate extensive swamps lying forward of the Stalin Line. Our strong representations that both corps should be kept on the original line of advance towards Ostrov proved of no avail, and I regret to say that our misgivings regarding the swamps turned out to be fully justified. 8th Panzer Division did strike a timbered roadway leading across the swamps, but this was already completely blocked by the vehicles of a Soviet motorized division. It took days to clear the route and replace the blown bridges. When the division finally emerged from the swamps, it ran into strong opposition which was broken only after relatively heavy fighting. 3. Motorized division found only a narrow causeway on which its vehicles could make no progress whatever. It had to be pulled out again and sent on to Ostrov behind 41 Panzer Corps. Better ground, though it included a strong line of concrete fortifications, was struck by the SS Death's Head Division in its advance on Zebash. And now there emerged a weakness which was bound to be inherent in troops whose officers and NCOs lacked solid training and proper experience. As far as its discipline and soldierly bearing went, the division in question undoubtedly made a good impression. I had even had reason to praise its extremely good march discipline, an important requirement for the efficient movement of motorized formations. The division always showed great dash in the assault and was steadfast in defence. Had it under my command on frequent occasions later on, and think it was probably the best Waffen-SS division I ever came across. Its commander in those days was a brave man who was soon wounded and later killed. None of these things, however, could compensate for deficient training in leadership. The division suffered excessive losses because its troops did not learn until they got into action what army units had mastered long ago. Their losses and lack of experience led them in turn to miss favourable opportunities, and this again caused unnecessary actions to be fought. I doubt if there is anything harder to learn than gauging the moment when a slackening of the enemy's resistance offers the attacker his decisive chance. The upshot of all this was that I repeatedly had to come to the division's assistance, without even then being able to prevent a sharp rise in casualties. After a matter of 10 days, the 3 regiments of the division had to be regrouped to form 2 new ones. Yet, bravely as the Waffen-SS divisions always fought, and fine though their achievements may have been, there is not the least doubt that it was an inexcusable mistake to set them up as a separate military organisation. Hand-picked replacements who could have filled the posts of NCOs in the army were expended on a quite inadmissible scale in the Waffen-SS, which in general paid a toll of blood incommensurate with its actual gains. Naturally, this cannot be laid at the door of the SS troops themselves. The blame for such unnecessary consumption of manpower must lie with the men who set up these special units for purely political motives, in the face of opposition from all the competent army authorities. In no circumstances must we forget, however, that the Waffen-SS, like the good comrades they were, fought shoulder to shoulder with the army at the front, and always showed themselves courageous and reliable. Without doubt, a large proportion of them would have been only too glad to be withdrawn from the jurisdiction of a man like Himmler and incorporated into the army. Before returning to the fortunes of 56 Panzer Corps, I should like to give the reader a picture of how the command staff of a tank formation had to work during the last war. As late as the Battle of St. Privat-Gravelotte, in the War of 1870-71, my grandfather assembled his staff on a hill from which he commanded a view of the entire battlefield and could personally direct the operations of his army corps. He was even able to ride over to the regiments as they deployed for the assault and, so the story goes, addressed some pretty harsh words to one battery for unlimbering too far from the enemy. Such scenes are naturally a thing of the past. The staffs of World War I were forced further and further to the rear as the range of enemy artillery fire increased, and the breadth of the fronts rendered visual survey and personal command on the battlefield a sheer impossibility. Efficient telephone links were the decisive thing from then on, and Schlieffen's picture of the supreme warlord who sat behind his desk issuing stirring orders over the telephone duly became a reality. World War II, in its turn, called for other methods of command, especially in the case of highly mobile formations. In the case of the latter, situations changed so rapidly, and favourable opportunities came and went so fast, that no tank force commander could afford to bind himself to a command post any great distance to the rear. If he waited too far back for reports from his forward units, decisions would be taken much too late and all kinds of chances would be missed. Often, too, when a successful action had just been fought, it was necessary to counteract the only too natural phenomenon of battle fatigue and to instill new life into the men. It was even more vital, in view of the unprecedented demands which our new war of movement made on the energies of officers and men, that higher commanders should show themselves as often as possible to the front-line troops. The ordinary soldier must never have the feeling that the top brass are busy concocting orders somewhere to the rear, without knowing what it looks like out in front. It gives him a certain satisfaction to see the commanding general in the thick of it once in a while, or watching a successful attack go in. Only by being up with the fighting troops day in and day out can one get to know their needs, listen to their worries, and be of assistance to them. A senior commander must not only be the man who perpetually has demands to make in the accomplishment of his mission, he must be an ally and a comrade as well. Quite apart from anything else, he himself derives fresh energy from these visits to the fighting troops. Many's the time, when visiting a divisional headquarters, that I have heard anxieties voiced about the diminishing battle morale of the fighting troops and the excessive strain to which they were often unavoidably subjected. Such worries inevitably preoccupied commanders more and more as time went on, for it was they who ultimately bore the responsibility for the regiments and battalions. Yet once I had gone forward to the troops in the line, I was often overjoyed to find them more confident and optimistic than I had been led to expect, not infrequently because they had fought a successful action in the meantime. And then, as I smoked a cigarette with a tank crew or chatted with a rifle company about the overall situation, I never failed to encounter that irrepressible urge to press onward, that readiness to put forth the very last ounce of energy, which are the hallmarks of the German soldier. Experiences like this are among the finest things a senior commander can ask for. The higher one rises, unfortunately, the rarer they become. An army or army group commander is quite unable to mix in with the fighting troops to the same extent as the general commanding a corps. The one man with any objection to living under canvas was our senior military assistant, who preferred to sleep in his car. Unfortunately, he had to leave his long legs sticking out through the door, with the result that he could never get his wet boots off after a rainy night. We always used to pitch our little camp in a wood or a copse near the main axis of advance, if possible by a lake or stream, so that we could take a quick plunge before breakfast, or whenever we came back caked with dust and grime from a trip to the front. While the Chief of Staff naturally had to stay behind the command post to deal with the work and telephone calls, I spent the days, and often part of the nights, out on the road. I usually left early in the morning after receiving the dawn situation reports and issuing any orders that were necessary to visit divisions and forward troops. At noon I would return to the command post for a while and then go out to visit another division, for as often as not it is just around eventide that success beckons or a fresh impetus is needed. By the time we returned to our tented camp, which would meanwhile have been shifted to a new location, we were dead tired and as black as sweeps. On such occasions it was a special treat to find that, thanks to the forethought of Major Niemann, my second assistant, we were to have a roast chicken or even a bottle of wine from his own small stock instead of the usual evening fare of rye bread, smoked sausage and margarine. I am afraid that however far forward we were, chickens and geese were very hard to come by, having as a rule been snapped up by other fanciers before we appeared on the scene. When, with the onset of the early autumn rains, it became rather too chilly to sit in the tents, we found it both pleasant and refreshing to use the sauna baths, which, however primitive in form, were to be found on almost every farmstead. Such flexible leadership on my part was, of course, possible only because I was able to take a wireless vehicle along with me on these trips under our excellent signals officer Kohler, who later became a general staff major. Thanks to the admirable speed with which he could raise our tactical staff or any divisional headquarters on the air, I was kept continuously informed of the situation throughout the corps sector, and decisions taken by me on the spot could be passed back with the minimum of delay. I might add that during my imprisonment after the war, Kohler proved a most unselfish friend and helper to my wife. Apart from my faithful drivers Nagel and Schumann and 2 outriders, my constant companion on these trips was my ADC, Lieutenant Specht. We called him Peppo because of his short, wiry figure and his youthful freshness and happy-go-lucky nature. He was a young cavalry officer of the best type, brisk, vigorous, somewhat irresponsible where danger was concerned, shrewd and quick on the uptake. He was always cheerful and slightly saucy. All these qualities had endeared him to me. He rode brilliantly. His father was a keen horse breeder, his mother a first-class horsewoman, and had won several big events as a newly commissioned officer just before the war. He was game for anything, and would have liked nothing better than to take his commanding general out on skirmishing patrols. As long as we belonged to a panzer corps and could be daily at the scene of action, Peppo was content with me and his lot, but when I became an army commander and could no longer be up at the front so often, he began to champ at the bit. It was a very proper attitude for a young officer, and I gave him his head on a number of occasions. In the Crimea, he twice led a reconnaissance squadron with great skill and dash. When we were in front of Leningrad, I again sent him to a division, but this time he crashed while on his way there in a Fieseler Storch. The loss was a heavy blow to me. Now let us return to 56 Panzer Corps. By 9th July, it had become clear that 4th Panzer Group's attempt to outflank the enemy forces, it believed to be at Pskov by sending our corps round to the east, had no hope of success on account of the marshiness of the ground and the strength of the enemy's resistance. There was nothing for it but to discontinue the manoeuvre and redirect Corps HQ and 8th Panzer Division onto the original northern axis towards Ostrov, as had already been done with 3 motorized infantry division. Still, since moving off from Dvinsk, the Corps had, according to intelligence reports available on 10th of July, smashed 4 or 5 of the enemy's infantry divisions, 1 armoured division and 1 motorized division, forces far superior to its own numerically. Apart from the thousands of prisoners we had taken, our booty since crossing the Reich frontiers included 60 aircraft, 316 guns, including anti-tank and anti-aircraft, 205 tanks and 600 lorries. But the enemy, though pushed back to the east, was still not destroyed, as was very soon to become apparent. Now that the Panzer Group was concentrated around Ostrov, we at 56 Panzer Corps hoped for a rapid, direct and uniform advance on Leningrad, with ourselves passing through Luga and 41 Panzer Corps through Pskov. In our view, this offered the best chance not only of effecting the quick capture of the city, but also of cutting off the enemy forces retreating through Livonia into Estonia before our 18th Army. The task of safeguarding this operation on its open eastern flank would have had to devolve on 16th Army as it moved up behind 4th Panzer Group. Presumably acting on directives from the highest level, however, Panzer Group HQ decided otherwise. 41 Panzer Corps was allotted the main road through Luga along which to advance on Leningrad. 56 Panzer Corps, once again pulling out to the east, was to advance through Porkhov and Novgorod to Chudovo in order to break communications between Leningrad and Moscow at the earliest possible date. Important though the latter task was, these orders must once again have led to the 2 corps becoming widely dispersed, as a result of which each was liable to be deprived of the necessary striking power. The danger was increased by the fact that much of the country to be crossed this side of Leningrad was marshy or wooded and hardly suitable for large armoured formations. A particularly regrettable step was the removal from 56 Panzer Corps of the SS Death's Head Division, which had meanwhile been relieved in the Zebesh-Opochka area by 290 Infantry Division. The SS Division was now retained south of Ostrov as the Panzer Group Reserve. Thus, as had previously happened when we set off from the German frontier, the Panzer Group's main effort was again placed on its left wing. 41 Panzer Corps. 56 Panzer Corps was dispatched on its wide sweep round to Chudovo with only 1 armoured and 1 infantry division, thereby being denied the essential protection of its open south flank by the SS Division following along in echelon on the right. It was a particularly risky move when one considered that even though the enemy forces engaged by the Corps to date had been outfought, they were far from annihilated. Be that as it may, we were still convinced that the Corps would continue to find its safety in speed of movement. 3. Motorized Division, which only came back under command at Ostrov, had already taken Porkhov on 10th of July after a hard struggle, and was put on a minor road leading north. 8th Panzer Division was to drive through Zoltsi to seize the vital crossing point where the Mashaga ran into Lake Ilmen. In a series of battles, most of them fierce ones, the advance was kept going for the next few days. Except for one attack on the Corps command post on the north bank of the Shelon River in the early hours of 14th of July, apparently carried out by enemy reconnaissance forces, the enemy had so far not made his presence felt on our open flank in the south. That same day, at my insistence, 8th Panzer Division, which had taken Zolci after a battle against an enemy well equipped with artillery and armour, pushed on to the Mashaga sector. It found the bridge already blown. Meanwhile, Panzer Group HQ had transferred the main effort of its advance even further west of the Luga Road. It had moved 41 Panzer Corps' 3 mechanised formations northwards to bar the way to the enemy forces retiring through Narva, north of Lake Peipus, before 18th Army. Only one infantry division of the Corps, the 269th, had been left on the road to Luga. Thus, 56 Panzer Corps suddenly found itself even more isolated than before in its wide swing towards Chudovo. Accordingly, we got on to Panzer Corps HQ to point out that if we were to carry out the Chudovo assignment, our corps must have the immediate support both of the SS Death's Head Division and also of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was relatively close behind. Before this appeal could be answered, however, 56 Panzer Corps was already in trouble. Early on 15th of July, we received a number of most unpleasant reports at the Corps command post on the Shilon, west of Zolci. The enemy had launched a powerful attack from the north into the flank of 8th Panzer Division, now strung out to the Mshaga, and simultaneously driven up from the south over the Shilon. This meant that the bulk of 8th Panzer Division's fighting troops, who were located between Zolci and the Mshaga, were cut off from the division's rear echelons, in whose area Corps HQ was located. But that was not all. The enemy had closed the trap behind ourselves too, by pushing up strong forces from the south to straddle our supply route. At the same time, 3 motorised division, advancing further northwards, found itself being attacked by superior enemy forces from the north and northeast at Mali Utagorsk. It was obviously the enemy's intention to encircle 56 Panzer Corps while it was isolated. The failure to echelon the SS Death's Head Division along our rear right flank had enabled him to attack across the Chalon with those of his forces which lay south of us. At the same time, the removal of 41 Panzer Corps from the Luga Road had released the strong enemy forces there, and these were now attacking our northern flank. Our corps' position at that moment was hardly an enviable one, and we could not help wondering whether we had taken rather too great a risk this time. Had we been carried away by our previous successes to the extent of paying insufficient heed to the enemy on our southern flank? Yet what other chance should we have of carrying out our mission? As matters stood, the only course open to us was to pull 8th Panzer Division back through Zolci to escape the encirclement that now threatened. 3. Motorised division had to be disengaged at the same time to give the corps back its freedom of movement. The next few days proved critical, with the enemy straining every nerve to keep up his encirclement and throwing in, besides his rifle divisions, 2 armoured divisions enjoying strong artillery and air support. 8th Panzer Division nevertheless managed to break through Zolci to the west and regroup, despite having to be temporarily supplied from the air. Before completing its own disengagement, 3 motorised division had to beat off 17 successive attacks. In the meantime, after Panzer Group HQ had put the SS Death's Head Division under our command, it was possible for us to clear the Corps supply route. By 18th July, the crisis was as good as over, the Corps being by then firmly established around Dino on a front facing roughly east by northeast. The earlier danger on our open flank in the south was removed by the proximity of 16th Army's 1 Corps, which was now drawing near Dino. One consolation was afforded us by the capture from a courier aircraft of a letter bearing the signature of Marshal Voroshilov, whom I had met in Moscow in 1931 and who now commanded the front opposite us. This not only confirmed that very substantial elements of the Soviet armies had been wiped out, but in the same connection referred specifically to the battles around Zolci. As long as we had been surrounded, our only links with the rear had been at best by wireless or aircraft. The very moment our lines of communication were restored, however, the usual plethora of paper descended on us. One item deserving special mention was an ominous inquiry telegraphed through from the Supreme Command. Moscow radio, in somewhat premature celebration of our Corps' encirclement, had reported the capture of certain top-secret data on our multiple rocket launcher. The Soviets had obviously taken an intense dislike to this new weapon, with which we were able to fire missiles of flaming oil. Already the Soviet army facing us had wirelessed a warning en clair that if we did not stop using it, they would retaliate with gas. An empty threat, of course, in view of the complete inadequacy of their own chemical warfare defences. In these circumstances, it was understandable that they should make such a song and dance about the capture of this information. Now we were being called upon to explain how a top-secret document could possibly fall into enemy hands. Obviously it had not been taken from the fighting troops, but from a transport column intercepted by the Soviets when they cut our supply route. This sort of thing was liable to happen to any armoured formation operating far ahead of its army front. In response to the Supreme Command's inquiry, we duly reported the facts of the case, adding that to avoid any further censure, we would henceforth refrain from cruising around on our own, some 60 miles behind the enemy lines. On 19th July, we had been informed by Panzer Group HQ that it now planned to send 56 Panzer Corps through Luga to Leningrad. 269 Infantry Division, which was assembled on the Luga road, had already been placed under our command. We still had no success with our proposal that the forces of the Panzer Group be at long last concentrated for concerted action, preferably up north with 41 Panzer Corps east of Narva, where there were 4 serviceable roads to Leningrad, rather than along the Luga axis, which ran through extensive woodlands. For the rest, we were first to launch an attack eastwards with 1 corps against the Myshaga sector, which we had already reached once before. Apparently the Supreme Command was still sticking to its plan for a wide outflanking movement, and was even prepared to go round to the east of Lake Ilmen. For the time being, therefore, we and First Corps were involved in fresh battles, in the course of which the enemy was thrown back across the Myshaga. On 20th July, we had a visit from the Oberquartiermeister Wiend of OKH, General Paulus. I put him in the picture about the battles we had fought to date, and pointed out how run down our Panzer Corps had become in country which was most unsuitable for the use of armoured troops. I also drew his attention to the disadvantages of scattering the Panzer Group's resources. The losses of our Corps' 3 mobile divisions already amounted to 6,000 men, and both the troops and equipment were being subjected to excessive strain, even though 8 Panzer Division had been able, during a few days' rest, to bring the number of its serviceable tanks back from 80 up to the 150 marks. I told Paulus that in my opinion the best thing to do would be to withdraw the entire Panzer Group from an area where a rapid advance was almost out of the question, and to use it against Moscow. If, on the other hand, the idea of driving on Leningrad and executing a wide encircling movement through Chudovo were to be maintained, it was essential that infantry be made available. Once the wooded zone had been cleared, our own corps must be saved for the final thrust on the city, otherwise the mobile divisions would reach Leningrad in no fit state for fighting. In any case, I pointed out, such an operation would take time. If we wanted to gain swift possession of Leningrad and the coastline, the only thing to do was to concentrate the whole Panzer Group up north in the area east of Narva, whence it could drive straight for the city. General Paulus entirely agreed with my views. Initially, however, things turned out quite differently. While 16th Army, consisting of 1 corps and another corps which had just arrived, took over the Myshaga front west of Lake Ilmen, it was decided after all that 56 Panzer Corps should now carry out the thrust on Leningrad up the route through Luga. For this purpose, we were allotted 3 motorised infantry division, 269 infantry division, and the newly arrived SS Police Division. This had the effect of dispersing the Panzer Group's mechanised forces further than ever. The SS Death's Head Division remained with 16th Army by Lake Ilmen, and 8 Panzer Division was taken into reserve by the Panzer Group to be initially employed on clearing the communications zone of partisans, a role for which it was not only far too valuable, but also quite unsuitable. The Corps now had only 1 mobile division, 3 motorised, in the Luga area, while 41 Panzer Corps' own 3 were in action east of Narva. The maxim established by Colonel General Guderian on the use of armour was "Klotzen, nicht klecken," don't spatter, boot 'em. In our own case, the very opposite course seemed to have been taken. All our efforts to retain the 3 mobile divisions, irrespective of which way our corps was sent, proved unsuccessful. Experience has long shown that when forces run short, only very few commanders manage to maintain a tidy order of battle and avoid splitting their formations. It would take up too much space here if I were to describe the battles around Luga. They proved very tough indeed. While the enemy had had only a very modest number of troops available in this area a few weeks previously, he had now brought his strength up to a full corps of 3 divisions supported by strong artillery and armour. To cap this, the country around Luga was a Russian training area, with which, of course, the enemy was intimately acquainted, and in addition he had had time to dig himself in properly. While these battles were still in progress, our corps was given a new task. At long last, it was to join up with 41 Panzer Corps in the north for the assault on Leningrad. Even now, however, only Corps HQ and 3 motorized division were involved. 8 Panzer and the SS Death's Head Division were to continue in their present role. On 15th of August, we handed over at Luga to HQ 50 Corps under General Lindemann, an old friend of mine from World War I days, and began moving north. The route to our new command post on Lake Samro, 25 miles southwest of Narva, was so bad that we took 8 hours to travel a distance of 125 miles. We had hardly reached Lake Samro late that evening when a telephone call was received from Panzer Group HQ ordering us to halt 3 motorized division, which was coming up behind us, and to drive straight down south again next morning to report to HQ 16th Army in Dino. We, together with 3 motorized division and the SS Death's Head Division, which was being pulled over from Lake Ilmen, were now to join that formation. No one will pretend that we were particularly pleased at these peregrinations. The one admirable exception was our quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt, whose cheerful equanimity was quite undaunted by the news that he would have to swing his supply and transport arrangements round through an angle of 180 degrees. So, on 16th of August, we moved back to Dino along the same dreadful route we had covered the day before. This time the distance was 160 miles, and we took 13 hours to do it. Luckily, 3 motorized had not come too far north and could be turned round in good time, but what the troops thought of it all I do not care to imagine. The ultimate reason for the change was probably that our sum total of forces was inadequate, and that the whole area between Leningrad, Pskov and Lake Ilmen was thoroughly unsuitable as tank country. The picture we were given on our arrival at HQ 16th Army was the following. 10 corps, fighting on the right wing of the army south of Lake Ilmen, had been attacked and pushed back by far superior enemy forces. 38th Soviet Army, comprising 8 divisions and cavalry formations. It was now fighting a difficult defensive battle south of Lake Ilmen, on a front facing south, with the enemy obviously trying to outflank it in the west. 56 Panzer Corps was to provide the urgently needed relief. Map 9. What our corps had to do, if possible without attracting the attention of the enemy, was to introduce its 2 mechanized divisions into his western flank east of Dino in order to roll up the front while he was busy attacking our own 10 corps in the north. The task confronting us was a pretty one, and it was gratifying to see how pleased the SS were to come back under our command. It was only a pity that we could not get 8 Panzer Division released for such a worthwhile operation. By 18th August, the carefully concealed move of the 2 divisions into camouflaged assembly areas in the enemy's western flank had been successfully completed, and when the corps unleashed its attack early next day, the enemy was obviously taken completely by surprise. Our plan to roll up the enemy front from the flank proved entirely successful, and in the engagements that followed, we and 10 corps, which had now returned to the attack, jointly succeeded in roundly defeating 38th Soviet Army. By 22nd August, we had reached the Lovat southeast of Staraya Russa, despite the fact that in that sandy terrain, with its almost complete absence of roads, The infantry of the two motorized divisions had to advance most of the way on foot. During those few days, 56 Panzer Corps alone captured 12,000 prisoners, 141 tanks, 246 guns, and several hundred automatic weapons and motor vehicles. The booty included two extremely interesting items. One was a brand new 8.8 cm anti-aircraft battery of German manufacture from the year 1941. The other was the very first Soviet salvo gun to fall into German hands. As I was most anxious to have the latter evacuated, I was all the more indignant to find that it could not be moved because somebody had helped himself to the tyres. The offender proved to be none other than my second assistant, Major Niemann, who had discovered that these tyres fitted our own command wagon. He looked somewhat crestfallen when told to hand them back for reassembly, while the fighting troops, who once again had to exert themselves to the utmost, were enjoying a brief rest on the Lovat. There was talk of withdrawing 56 Panzer Corps for employment elsewhere. But then 16th Army's eastward advance south of Lake Ilmen was resumed after all. At the end of August, however, the first rains of that summer set in, turning every road into such a quagmire that for a while both motorized divisions were completely stuck. At the same time, the enemy moved up new forces. In lieu of his beaten 38th Army, 3 new armies appeared along the Kulm-Ilmen front opposite our own 16th Army, the 27th, 34th and 11th. Fresh battles ensued, but to describe these in detail would take up too much space. 56 Panzer Corps forced a crossing over the Pola and pushed on to a point just short of Demyansk. Quite apart from the fact that enemy resistance was stiffening, the painful effort of advancing a long road several feet deep in mud imposed a particular strain on both men and equipment. During this period, the whole of my time was spent out with my divisions, but even my sturdy Kubelwagen often had to be towed by a tractor to make any headway on those so-called roads. During this period, even we came to feel the divergence between the aims pursued by Hitler, Leningrad, and OKH, Moscow. The commander of 16th Army, Colonel General Busch, told me he intended to push east as far as the Valdai Heights so that he could later advance in the direction Kalinin-Moscow. It seemed that HQ Northern Army Group did not agree, principally because it was worried by the prospect of bearing the army's eastern flank. While at the beginning of September, 57 Panzer Corps intervened in our operations from the area of Central Army Group in the south, we ourselves were told on 12th September that we would shortly be moved south with 3 motorized division to come under command of 9th Army in Central Army Group. Even as a corps commander, one could make neither head nor tail of all this chopping and changing, though I did form the impression that it was all ultimately due to the tug-of-war evidently going on between Hitler and OKH over whether the strategic aim should be Moscow or Leningrad. At all events, the battles which 16th Army fought in those weeks with 56 Panzer Corps taking part were continuously successful, and on 16th September, OKW was able to announce the defeat of substantial elements of the 11th, 27th and 34th Soviet armies. 9 enemy divisions were considered to have been destroyed, and 9 more badly battered. We still failed to find any real satisfaction in these achievements, however, for no one was clear any longer what the actual aim of our strategy was, or what higher purpose all these battles were supposed to serve. Whatever else might happen, the period of sensational advances of the kind we had made on Dvinsk was at an end. My days at the head of 56 Panzer Corps were now numbered. On the evening of 12th September, under a steady downpour of rain, I was sitting in my tent with 1 or 2 officers of my staff. Ever since it had begun to get dark early, we had taken to playing bridge to while away the time until the evening situation reports came in. Suddenly the telephone rang at my elbow, and I was asked to take a call from my friend Busch, the army commander. A telephone message at this late hour did not usually bode anything pleasant, but on this occasion Busch read me out an order that had come over the teleprinter from OKH. General of the Infantry versus Manstein will leave forthwith for Southern Army Group to assume command of 11th Army. Every soldier will sense how proud and happy I felt at the prospect of leading a whole army from now on. To me, at the time, this seemed the peak of my military career. Early next morning I took leave, only by telephone, unfortunately, of the divisions under my command, and then bade farewell to my own staff. In doing so, I had grateful memories of all that 56 Panzer Corps and its staff had achieved in the past months, when the headquarters and divisions had grown into a thoroughly integrated unit. Joyful though I was in taking over this new and bigger task, I was nevertheless fully aware that probably the most satisfying phase of my life as a soldier was now over. For 3 whole months I had lived close to the fighting troops, sharing not only their trials and tribulations, but also the pride of their successes. Time and again I had been able to derive fresh energy from the very fact of this common experience, from the cheerful devotion with which everyone went about his duty, and from the intimacy of comradeship. From now on, my position would prevent me from working among the troops to the extent I had done to date. It was unlikely that I should ever again live through anything comparable to the impetuous dash of 56 Panzer Corps in the first days of the campaign, the fulfillment of all a tank force commander's dreams. I thus found the leave-taking extremely hard, most of all from my experienced Chief of Staff, Colonel Baron Wies Elverfeldt, a cool, high-minded and never-failing counsellor. The same applied to my high-spirited and talented Chief of Operations, Major Detlefsen, the head of my intelligence branch, Guido versus Kessel, and that indefatigable quartermaster, Major Kleinschmidt. Another of those I had to leave behind me was the head of my Adjutant General's branch, Major V.D. Marwitz, who had joined us only a few weeks previously, and with whom I had close ties of friendship dating back to the days we had spent together in Pomerania and at the military academy. When I left on the morning of 13th of September to take formal leave of my friend Bush, the only people I could take with me were my ADC, Specht, and my 2 drivers, Nagel and Schumann. Not one of them is alive today. If I now attempt to describe the battles fought in the Crimea by 11th Army and its Romanian fellow combatants, my main reason for doing so is to commemorate my comrades of the Crimean Army. At the same time, I should like to give the men who survived those battles a general account of the events of which they could have had only an incomplete picture at the time. These men put up a tremendous performance in the period 1941-2, fighting one battle after another against an adversary who almost invariably outnumbered them. In attack and pursuit, their aggressive spirit was unparalleled, and when the situation appeared hopeless, they would stand and fight unflinchingly. Often they may not have known what compelled us to make demands on them that seemed impossible to fulfill, or why they were flung from one action to another and from one front to the next. And yet they went to the very limit of endurance to carry out these demands, reciprocating the trust of those who led them. But 11th Army's campaign in the Crimea also deserves attention outside the immediate circle of its participants, for it is one of the few cases where an army was still able to operate independently in a segregated theatre of war, left to its own devices and free of interference from the Supreme Command. It was a campaign which, in 10 months of incessant fighting, included both offensive and defensive battles, mobile warfare with full freedom of action, a headlong pursuit operation, landings by an enemy in control of the sea, partisan engagements, and an assault on a powerfully defended fortress. Finally, the campaign is of interest because it was fought over the Black Sea Peninsula, which even today bears traces of the Greeks, Goths, Genoese, and Tartars. Once before, in the War of 1854-6, this had been a focal point of history, and the names of places which played a role then, the Alma, Balaclava, Inkerman, and Malakoff, will be heard here all over again. Operationally, however, the War of 1854-6 can in no way be compared with the campaign fought in 1941-2. In the former case, the Western powers enjoyed naval supremacy and all the advantages this implies, whereas in the Crimean campaign of 1941-2, it was the Russians who controlled the Black Sea. Our 11th Army had not only to conquer the Crimea and Sevastopol, but also to contend with all the possibilities open to the Russians by reason of their mastery at sea. On 17 September 1941, I arrived at 11th Army HQ in Nikolaev, the Russian naval base at the mouth of the Bug, and took over command. My predecessor, Colonel General Ritter versus Schobert, had been buried in the city the day before. On one of his daily visits to the front, he had landed on a Russian minefield in his Fieseler Storch aircraft, and both he and his pilot had been killed. In him, the German army lost an officer of great integrity and one of its most experienced front-line soldiers. His troops would have followed him anywhere. HQ 11th. Army, whose operations staff was later to form the headquarters of Don Army Group, was almost without exception a superb team of men, and I have grateful memories of the assistance I received from so many splendid officers in 2.5 tough years of war. We got on extraordinarily well together, and when I relinquished my command in 1944, many of them did not want to remain on the staff. The novelty of my new position did not end with the expansion of my sphere of command from an army corps into an army. I did not discover until I reached Nikolaev that in addition to 11th Army, I was also to take over 3rd Romanian Army, which was affiliated to it. For political reasons, the actual chain of command in this part of the Eastern Front had not been easy to arrange. Command of the Allied forces committed from Romania, 3rd and 4th Romanian Armies and 11th German Army, had been entrusted to the Romanian head of state, Marshal Antonescu, but at the same time he was bound by the directives of Southern Army Group, commanded by Field Marshal Verser Rundstedt. HQ. 11th Army had been acting as the connecting link between the Marshal and Army Group HQ, and had advised him on operational matters. By the time I arrived, however, the situation was such that Antonescu only retained control of 4th Romanian Army, which he had directed to attack Odessa. The other Romanian army taking part in the campaign, the 3rd, had been placed under the command of 11th Army, which henceforth took its orders directly from HQ Southern Army Group. At the best of times, it is embarrassing for an army headquarters to have to control another self-contained army in addition to its own, and the task was necessarily twice as difficult when the army in question happened to be an Allied one. What made things harder still was that there were not only certain differences of organisation, training and leadership between the two armies, as is always the case where allies are concerned, but also a noticeable contrast in their fighting qualities. From time to time this led us to take a firmer hand in our allies' handling of an operation than was usual with our own forces or desirable in the interest of good relations. That we were able, despite these difficulties, to collaborate with the Romanian headquarters staffs and fighting units without any real friction occurring was primarily due to the loyalty of the commander of 3rd Romanian Army, General, later Colonel General, Dumitrescu. The German liaison teams which we had attached to all Romanian staffs down to divisional level also contributed by their tact and, when necessary, by their firmness to this cooperation. The man most deserving of mention in this respect, however, is Marshal Antonescu. Whatever verdict posterity may pass on him as a politician, Antonescu was a real patriot, a good soldier, and certainly our most loyal ally. He was a soldier who, having once bound up his country's destiny with that of the Reich, did everything possible until his overthrow to put Romania's military power and war potential to effective use on our side. If this did not always work out quite as he had hoped, the reason was to be found in the internal circumstances of his state and his regime. At all events, he remained faithful to his allies, and I can only speak with gratitude of our work together. As for the Romanian army, there is no doubt that it had considerable weaknesses. Although the Romanian soldier, who was usually of peasant origin, was modest in his wants and usually a capable, brave fighter, the possibilities of training him as an individual fighting man who could think for himself in action, let alone as a non-commissioned officer, were to a great extent limited by the low standard of general education in Romania. In cases where members of the German minority did come up to the necessary standard, Romanian national prejudice tended to impede any advancement. Neither were such outmoded practices as flogging likely to improve the quality of the rank and file. Their effect was rather to make Romanian soldiers of German stock do everything they could to join one of the German armed services, or, since the latter were not allowed to accept them, the Waffen-SS. One disadvantage, as far as the inner stability of Romanian troops was concerned, was the absence of a non-commissioned officer corps as we know it. I am afraid people in Germany nowadays are all too ready to forget what a debt we have owed in the past to our excellent body of regular NCOs. Another factor of far-reaching importance was that a considerable proportion of the Romanian officers holding senior and medium appointments were not up to requirement. Most of all, the Romanians lacked that close link between officers and men, which tends to be taken for granted in the German army. Man management with them was entirely devoid of the Prussian tradition. Because they had no war experience, the combat training of the Romanians fell short of the exigencies of modern warfare. This led to unnecessary losses, which in turn was bound to affect morale. The military leaders, who had been under French influence since 1918, still thought in terms of World War I. Weapons and equipment were partly obsolete and also inadequate. This was particularly true of the anti-tank units, with the result that they could hardly be expected to hold their ground against Soviet tank attacks. Whether Germany could not have rendered more effective help in this respect is a question for others to decide. One final drawback regarding the use of Romanian troops on the Eastern Front was their terrific respect for the Russians. In difficult situations, this was liable to end in a panic. Indeed, it is a problem of which account must be taken in any war against Russia involving Southeast European nations. In the case of the Bulgarians and Serbs, the insecurity is increased by their sense of Slavonic affinity. There was one other factor that could not be entirely disregarded in any assessment of the combat efficiency of Romanian troops. At the time with which we are dealing, Romania had already attained her fundamental war aim, the reconquest of Bessarabia. Even Transnistria, the territory between the Dniester and Bug, which she had been persuaded to accept by Hitler, did not really lie within the scope of Romania's aspirations. It was understandable that the idea of pushing even further into the Russia they dreaded so much was none too warmly received by many Romanians. Despite all the defects and reservations mentioned above, however, the Romanian troops performed their duty as best they could. Above all, they always readily submitted to German military leadership and did not, like other allies of ours, put matters of prestige before material necessity. Undoubtedly, the soldierly mentality of Marshal Antonescu exerted a decisive influence in this respect. To sum up, the verdict given me at the time by my advisers was that in the event of any substantial losses, 3rd Romanian Army would cease to be capable of offensive action and only be fit for defence if reinforced by German corset bones. The sector I had to command formed the southernmost wing of the Eastern Front. Broadly speaking, it embraced the Crimea and the part of the Dnieper Bend south of Zaporozhye. There was no direct contact with the main forces of Southern Army Group advancing north of the Dnieper, which was all to the good as far as 11th Army's operational freedom was concerned. After the forest tracts of northern Russia, in which I had last had to operate with a tank corps unsuited to that type of country, I now found myself in the vast expanses of the steppes, which were almost entirely devoid of natural obstacles, even if they did not offer any cover either. It was ideal tank country, but unfortunately 11th Army had no tanks. The only variety was offered by the smaller rivers, the beds of which dried up in summertime to form deep, steep-banked fissures known as bulkers. Nevertheless, the very monotony of the steppes gave them a strange and unique fascination. Everyone was captivated at one time or other by the endlessness of the landscape, through which it was possible to drive for hours on end, often guided only by the compass, without encountering the least rise in the ground or setting eyes on a single human being or habitation. The distant horizon seemed like some mountain ridge behind which a paradise might beckon, but it only stretched on and on. The poles of the Anglo-Iranian telegraph line, built some years before by Siemens, alone served to break the eternal sameness of it all. Yet at sunset these steps were transformed into a dazzling blaze of colour. In the eastern part of the Nogaisk steppes, around and northeast of Melitopol, one came upon lovely villages with such German names as Karlsruhe and Helenenthal. They lay in the midst of rich fruit plantations, their well-built stone houses bearing witness to a past prosperity. The inhabitants still spoke the purest German, but they were almost all old men, women and children. The men had been deported by the Soviet authorities. The task assigned to 11th Army by the Supreme Command inevitably committed it in two divergent directions. On one hand, by advancing on the right wing of Southern Army Group, it was intended to continue pursuing the enemy as he withdrew eastwards. To this end, the main body of the army was to be brought forward along the north coast of the Sea of Azov in the general direction of Rostov. On the other hand, the army was also meant to take the Crimea, a task given special priority. One reason for this was the favourable effect the capture of the peninsula was expected to have on the attitude of Turkey. Another, even more pressing one, was the threat of the enemy's big Crimean air bases to the Romanian oil fields, so vital to Germany. After the Crimea had been taken, the 11th Army's corps of mountain troops was to move over the Straits of Kerch towards the Caucasus, evidently to reinforce an offensive beyond Rostov. At that time, therefore, the Supreme Command still had pretty far-reaching aims for the 1941 campaign. It was soon to become apparent that the dual role allotted to 11th Army was unrealistic. At the beginning of September, 11th Army had forced a crossing over the lower Dnieper at Berislavl, an exceptional feat of arms in which the main part had been played by 22 Lower Saxon Infantry Division. Nonetheless, it marked the point where the duality of the army's task inevitably brought about a cleavage in its axis of advance. When I took command, I found myself confronted by the following situation. 2 army corps, 30 Corps under General Versasalmuth, 72 and 22 infantry divisions and the Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, and 49 Mountain Corps under General Kubier, 170 infantry division and 1 and 4 mountain divisions, had continued their eastward pursuit of the enemy after his defeat on the Dnieper and were approaching the line from Melitopol to the Dnieper bend south of Zaporozhye. 1 Corps, the 54th under General Hansen, had been diverted to the approach to the Crimea, the Perekop Isthmus. 50 Infantry Division, which had come from Greece, was partly under 4th Romanian Army before Odessa and partly engaged in mopping up the Black Sea coast. 3rd Romanian Army, comprising a mountain corps, 1, 2 and 4 mountain brigades, and a cavalry corps, 5, 6 and 8 cavalry brigades, was still west of the Dnieper, where it proposed to rest for a while. In doing so, it was probably guided by a desire to avoid any advance beyond the river, since it had already exceeded Romania's political aims in having to cross the Bug. Faced with this dual mission of pursuing the enemy eastwards to Rostov and conquering the Crimea for a subsequent drive through Kerch to the Caucasus, 11th Army headquarters had to decide whether to deal with the two divergent tasks simultaneously or in chronological order. A decision which was really the responsibility of the Supreme Command was thus left to an army. It seemed quite certain that both tasks could not be solved simultaneously with the forces we had at our disposal. The capture of the Crimea called for a considerably stronger force than 54 Corps, now facing Perekop. Although the intelligence picture indicated that only 3 divisions of the enemy army were likely to have escaped from the Dnieper into the isthmus, it was not clear what forces the Russians had available in the Crimea itself, particularly at Sevastopol. Soon afterwards it emerged that the enemy could put not 3, but 6 divisions into action in the isthmus itself. These were later to be reinforced by the Soviet army then defending Odessa, i.e. from the sea, Tata. In view of the nature of the ground, however, a stubborn defence by even 3 enemy divisions would probably suffice to deny 54 Corps access to the Crimea, or at least to cause it considerable losses in the fight through the isthmus. The Crimea is divided from the mainland by the so-called lazy sea, the Zivash. This is a kind of mudflat or brackish swamp, almost impassable for infantry and an absolute obstacle to assault boats on account of its extreme shallowness. There are only two firm approaches to the Crimea, the Isthmus of Perekop in the west and a neck of land running west of Genichesk in the east. The latter is so narrow in places as only to leave room for a causeway and railway embankment, both of which are interspersed with long stretches of bridges. For the purpose of an attack, therefore, it was quite useless. As even the Perekop Isthmus was less than 5 miles wide, the assault would have to be purely frontal and over ground quite devoid of cover. A flanking attack was ruled out by the proximity of the sea on either side. In addition to being already equipped with strong field defences, the isthmus was cut straight across the middle by Tartar's Ditch, an ancient earthwork anything up to 50 feet in depth. Once the Perekop Isthmus had been broken through, there was another bottleneck to be tackled further south at Ishun, where salt lakes reduced the potential assault front to a mere 2 miles. In view of these difficulties on the ground and the enemy's superiority in the air, we had to expect a hard and exhausting struggle. Even if we succeeded in breaking through at Perekop, it was doubtful whether the corps would still have the strength to fight a second battle at Ishun. In any case, 2 or 3 divisions would never be enough to conquer the whole of Crimea, including Sevastopol. To ensure a swift occupation of Crimea, therefore, the army had at all costs to detach strong additional forces from its pursuit group now heading eastwards. What remained should still suffice for the pursuit as long as the enemy continued to withdraw, though it would be too weak for an objective as remote as Rostov if he were to form a new front further back or actually bring up fresh forces. Should it be considered crucial to advance on Rostov, Crimea would have to be left behind for the time being. In that event, however, it would be difficult to tell when, if ever, the forces needed to conquer the peninsula could be made available. Besides, in the hands of an enemy with command of the sea, Crimea was liable to become a serious menace deep in the flank of the eastern front, quite apart from the fact that the air bases would continue to threaten the Romanian oil fields. If the attempt were made to conduct a far-reaching operation towards and beyond Rostov with 2 army corps, and simultaneously to conquer Crimea with 1 other corps, the only result could be that neither objective would be effectively attained. 11th Army accordingly decided to give priority to Crimea. At all costs, we were determined not to tackle this task with insufficient forces. As a matter of course, 54 Corps was given all the available army artillery, engineers and anti-aircraft guns, in addition to which it was to call forward 50 Infantry Division from its rear location at the latest in time for the second phase, the battle for the Ishun Isthmus. But this was still not enough. It was imperative to have a second corps to conquer Crimea quickly after the breakthrough, if indeed it were not actually needed to fight through the lakes at Ishun. We decided that this should be the German Mountain Corps, which the Supreme Command had anyway earmarked in its directives to be moved up through Kerch to the Caucasus later on. Meanwhile, this formation of 2 divisions could be put to better use in the mountainous parts of southern Crimea than out in the steppes. Apart from all this, an attempt was to be made, once we had broken into the peninsula itself, to take the fortress of Sevastopol by a surprise thrust with motorized units. For this purpose, the Leibstandarte was to assemble behind 54 Corps when it went into the assault. These dispositions naturally entailed a considerable weakening of the army's eastern front. All that could be found to replace the forces there, apart from the elements of 22 Infantry Division being used on coastal defence north of Crimea, was 3rd Romanian Army. Despite the Romanian inhibitions to which I alluded earlier, I was able to arrange in a personal talk with General Dumitrescu that his army should be moved quickly forward over the Dnieper. It was perfectly clear that the measures taken by 11th Army would involve considerable risks if the enemy on its eastern front were to halt his retreat and try to regain the initiative there. This was the price that had to be paid if we were to avoid attempting the capture of Crimea with inadequate forces. While supply difficulties caused the preparations for 54 Corps' attack on the Perekop Isthmus to drag on till 24 September, and our forces were still regrouping on the lines already indicated, there were signs of a change in the situation on the Army's eastern front from 21 September onwards. The enemy had taken up prepared positions along a front from west of Melitopol to the Dnieper Bend, with the result that the pursuit had to be discontinued. Nonetheless, the army went ahead with the disengagement of the German Mountain Corps, giving orders for the remaining German formations to be mixed in with those of 3rd Romanian Army in order to keep the risk down to a minimum. The Romanian Cavalry Corps in the southern sector of this front was incorporated into 30 German corps, while 3rd Romanian Army in the north took over 170 German Infantry Division to bolster the Romanian Mountain Corps. By 24th September 54th Corps was able to move into the assault on the Perekop Isthmus. Though given maximum artillery support, 45 and 73 infantry divisions had the hardest possible conditions to fight under, having to advance in blazing sunshine across salt steppes on which there was no trace of water or cover. The enemy had transformed the isthmus into a powerful 10-mile-deep defence system, and he fought bitterly for every single trench and strong point. Nevertheless, after warding off strong enemy counterattacks, the Corps took Perekop and crossed Tartars Ditch on 26 September. 3 more days' intensive fighting saw it through the rest of the enemy's defence zone, and after the capture of the strongly defended locality of Armyansk, out into more open country. The enemy fell back between the Ishun lakes, having suffered heavy losses in killed and left 10,000 prisoners, 112 tanks and 135 guns in our hands. But the fruit of this hard-won victory, the final breakout into Crimea, could still not be plucked. Although the enemy's losses had been heavy, the number of divisions facing the Corps had meanwhile risen to 6. In all likelihood, any attempt to go straight ahead with the storming of the Ishun bottleneck would have been too much for our troops, in view of the relative strengths involved and the tremendous sacrifices it would have imposed on the German Corps. As for 11th Army's proposal to have reinforcements to hand at this juncture in the form of the Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte, the enemy had already thwarted it. Obviously anticipating that we were intent on a speedy conquest of the Crimea, he had brought fresh forces up to his front between the Sea of Azov and the Dnieper. Here, on 26 September, he had attacked our army's eastern front with 2 new armies, the 18th and 9th, consisting of 12 divisions which were mainly new arrivals or recently rested. In the first assault, he had admittedly failed to score any successes against our own 30 Corps, though even here the situation became pretty tense. But in the sector of 3rd Romanian Army, he had overrun the latter's 4 mountain brigade and torn a gap 10 miles wide in the army front. The brigade in question had lost the bulk of its artillery and seemed to be at the end of its tether. Both the other Romanian mountain brigades had also suffered severe losses. We now had no choice but to make the German Mountain Corps, which was already on its way to the Perekop Isthmus, do a right-about turn in order to set about restoring the position of 3rd Romanian Army. Simultaneously, moreover, 11th Army was virtually deprived of the services of its one fast-moving formation, the Leibstandarte, as we were now ordered by the Supreme Command to hold it in hand for the drive on Rostov as part of 1st Panzer Group, to which it would shortly be transferred. We thus had to abstain from using the Leibstandarte to exploit the success in the isthmus, and it was likewise ordered back to the eastern front. In order to be close to the Army's 2 fronts, the Army Operations Branch had on 21 September established a tactical headquarters at Askania Nova in the Nogaisk steppes, which had once been the property of a German family, the Pfalz-Feins. Formerly a model estate known all over Russia, it had now become a collective farm. The manor buildings were sadly neglected, and the retreating Soviet troops had destroyed all the machinery, just as they had thrown petrol over the mountains of threshed wheat lying out in the open air and set them on fire. The latter smouldered for weeks on end without our being able to extinguish them. The increasing gravity of the situation on the army's front impelled us to move close up behind the danger spot, with a small tactical staff on 29 September. This is always an expedient measure in times of crisis, if only because it prevents subordinate staffs from pulling out early and making a bad impression on the troops. On the occasion in question, it was particularly appropriate in view of the tendency of many Romanian headquarters staffs to change their locations prematurely. The same day, the German Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte delivered a thrust into the enemy's southern flank, where he had broken into 3rd Romanian Army but had failed to exploit his initial success properly. While it was possible to restore the situation in this area, a fresh crisis was brewing on the northern wing of 30 Corps, where a Romanian cavalry brigade had given way. I had to intervene vigorously there and then to prevent its hasty withdrawal. The threatened breakthrough was then parried by swinging round the Leibstandarte to meet it. Tense though the situation on our eastern front had become as a result of the events described above, it also had the makings of a golden opportunity. By launching repeated attacks to frustrate our intentions in the Crimea, the enemy had tied both his armies down on a frontal basis and obviously now had no further reserves with which to protect himself against the Dnieper crossings at Zaporozhye and Dnipropetrovsk, whence General versus Kleist's 1st Panzer Group could break out against his northern flank. After I had made representations to Southern Army Group some days previously in favour of an intervention from this quarter, the appropriate orders were issued on 1st October. While 11th Army kept a tight hold on the still attacking enemy, the Panzer Group steadily increased its pressure from the north. Now the enemy began to yield, and by 1st October it was the turn of 30 Corps and 3rd Romanian Army to go over to the attack. In the next few days, in cooperation with 1st Panzer Group, we succeeded in encircling the mass of both enemy armies in the area Bol, Tokmak, Mariupol, Berdyansk, or in destroying them as they retreated. Some 65,000 prisoners, 125 tanks and over 500 guns found their way into German hands on this occasion. Following the Battle of the Sea of Azov, a change was made in the order of battle of the German southern wing. The Supreme Command seemed to have realized that no army could simultaneously fight one operation in the direction of Rostov and another in the Crimea, and from now on the advance on Rostov was entrusted to 1st Panzer Group, to which 11th Army was ordered to hand over 49 Mountain Corps and the Leibstandarte. 11th Army was given the sole task of conquering the Crimea with its 2 remaining army corps. Of these, 30 Corps comprised 22, 72 and 170 infantry divisions, and 54 Corps was composed of 46, 73 and 50 infantry divisions, 1/3 of the last named being still outside Odessa. 3rd Romanian Army, which now reverted to the command of Marshal Antonescu, was merely to be responsible for coastal defence on the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. After I had approached the Marshal directly, however, he agreed to let me take the headquarters of the Romanian Mountain Corps, with 1 cavalry and 1 mountain brigade under command, into the Crimea to screen the eastern coastline. Now that 11th Army's mission was reduced to the single aim of conquering the Crimea, however, the Supreme Command became all the more impatient for a corps to be put across the Straits of Kerch towards the Kuban at the earliest possible date. Realizing from this demand how much Hitler was underestimating the enemy, 11th Army felt impelled to point out that the prior conditions for any such operation must be the complete clearance of the Crimea. The enemy would undoubtedly fight to the last for the peninsula and would abandon Odessa rather than Sevastopol. Indeed, as long as the Soviets had even 1 foot in the Crimea, there could be no question of throwing part of 11th Army, which had only 2 corps anyway, through Kerch to the Kuban. As it was, we took this opportunity to put in a bid for an extra corps of 3 divisions, and within the next few weeks, primarily, one would suppose, because of Hitler's above-mentioned requirement, the army was augmented by 42 corps headquarters and 132 and 24 infantry divisions. In consequence of the Russians' desperate efforts to hold on to the Crimea, these reinforcements were to prove indispensable for the peninsular battles alone. The immediate problem, however, was to resume the struggle for the approaches to the Crimea and to open up the way through Ishun. Just another assault operation, one might say. Yet that 10-day battle towers above the normal type of offensive action as a shining example of the aggressive spirit and self-sacrifice of the German soldier. In it, we lacked almost all the advantages which are generally regarded as prior necessities for an attack on fortified positions. Numerical superiority was on the side of the Soviet defenders, not of the German attackers. 11th Army's total of 6 divisions was very soon confronted by 8 Soviet rifle and 4 cavalry divisions, for on 16th of October the Russians had evacuated the fortress of Odessa, until then the object of so many unsuccessful assaults by 4th Romanian Army, and transferred the defending army to the Crimea by sea. Despite the Luftwaffe's claim to have sunk 32,000 tons of shipping, the bulk of the convoys from Odessa had still made landfall at Sevastopol or harbours along the west coast of the peninsula. The first divisions of this Soviet army duly appeared at the battlefront shortly after the start of our offensive. The German artillery was certainly superior to the enemy's and effectively supported the attacking infantry. But on the enemy side, armour-plated coastal batteries were able to intervene from the northwest coast of the Crimea and the southern bank of the Zivash without the German guns initially being able to get to grips with them. And while the Russians had abundant armour to draw on for their counterattacks, 11th Army did not possess a single tank. Above all, senior commanders had hardly any opportunity to lighten the troops' arduous task by tactical manoeuvre. In that situation, it was quite impossible to take the enemy by surprise, since all he had to do was to sit in his well-constructed fieldworks and wait for the assault to develop. As had been the case at Perekop, the sea on one side and the Zivash on the other excluded any possibility of outflanking or even enfilading the enemy. On the contrary, it was necessary to carry the attack forward purely frontally along the 3 narrow strips of land into which the isthmus was divided by the lakes lying within it. The breadth of these 3 strips allowed us to commit only the 3 divisions of 54 Corps, 73, 46 and 22, in the first instance, 30 Corps being unable to go in until a certain amount of elbow room had been gained further south. The salt steppes of the isthmus, flat as a pancake and bare of vegetation, offered no cover whatever to the attacker. Yet the air above them was dominated by the Soviet Air Force, whose fighters and fighter bombers dived incessantly on any target they could find. Not only the frontline infantry and field batteries had to dig in, it was even necessary to dig pits for every vehicle and horse behind the battle zone as protection against enemy aircraft. Things got so bad that anti-aircraft batteries no longer dared to fire in case they were immediately wiped out from the air. Not until the last days of the offensive, after Mulders and his fighter group had been called in to assist the army, could the sky be kept clear, and even then only in the hours of daylight. At night time, not even Mulders could help. Under such combat conditions, and in the face of an opponent who stubbornly defended every inch of ground, the demands made on the attacking troops were bound to be abnormally high, and their losses very considerable. Throughout this period, I was constantly on the road to see for myself how things were going and what assistance could be rendered to the fighting units in their difficult struggle. I was alarmed by the way fighting power deteriorated. The divisions carrying out this tough assignment had already made heavy sacrifices at Perekop or in the Azov battle, and the time came when one wondered whether the struggle for the narrow corridors could possibly succeed, or, assuming that we did manage to break through, whether our forces would still be equal to winning the Crimea from an enemy whose strength was constantly on the increase. By 25th October, the troops seemed too exhausted to go on with the attack. Twice already the commander of one particularly good division had reported that the regiments under his command were at the end of their strength. This was the hour that usually comes sooner or later in such a contest, when the outcome of the battle is on the razor's edge. It was the hour that must show whether the will of the attacker to exert himself to the very limit of physical endurance is stronger than that of the defender to go on resisting. The struggle of deciding whether to call for a last supreme effort, at the risk of having ultimately demanded all that sacrifice in vain, is one that can only be fought out in the heart of the commander concerned. It would be pointless, however, were it not inspired by the confidence of the troops and their determination not to give up the fight. 11th Army was not prepared. After all, it had had to ask of the fighting troops to throw victory away through its own weakness at what might be 1 minute to 12. As it turned out, the unbroken aggressive spirit of the troops overcame even the enemy's grim resolution to hold out. After one more day of hard effort, 27th October brought the final success. On 18th October, at the end of 10 days of the most bitter fighting, the Soviet defence collapsed. 11th Army could take up the pursuit. The chase which followed gave one more splendid example of the boldness and initiative of commanders at all levels and the self-denial of the fighting troops. The sight of those regiments, weakened by their heavy losses and well-nigh exhausted by the unprecedented demands of the campaign, yet racing towards the tempting goal of the South Crimean coast, put one in mind of the soldiers of another army who in 1796 stormed the fields of Italy promised them by Napoleon. By 16th November, the furious chase was over, and the whole of the Crimea, except for the fortified area of Sevastopol, was in our hands. The 6 divisions of 11th Army had wiped out the best part of 2 enemy armies, totalling 12 rifle and 4 cavalry divisions. Of his initial strength of around 200,000 men, the enemy had lost over 100,000 as prisoners in the struggle for the 2 necks of land and the pursuit that followed, as well as 700 guns and 160 tanks. What troops had been able to escape across the Straits of Kerch or into Sevastopol were mere debris and without any heavy weapons. The fact that those taking refuge in the fortress could immediately be reformed into proper units was due to the enemy's command of the sea, which enabled him to bring in replacements and stores with a minimum of delay. While the administrative branches of 11th Army HQ moved into Simferopol, the largely Russianized capital of the Crimea lying in beautiful surroundings on the northern edge of the Yaila Mountains, our tactical headquarters went to Zarabus, a sizable village north of the city, where we found very suitable accommodation in one of the new schools built by the Soviets in almost all the bigger country places. I personally lived with the Chief of Staff in the small farmhouse of the fruit-growing collective, where each of us had a modest room to himself. The furniture in my own consisted of a bed, a table and chair, a stool for the wash bowl to stand on, and a few clothes hooks. Naturally, we could have obtained some furniture from Simferopol, but our staff did not believe in indulging in comforts which the ordinary soldier had to do without. Except for 2 brief stays at a command post on the Kerch front and the period in which the tactical headquarters was up in front of Sevastopol, we remained in these unpretentious quarters until August 1942. After the nomadic life we had led to date, it was a complete change for all of us, though not necessarily a welcome one. Whenever a formation staff becomes static, the inevitable result is not only a settled day-to-day routine, but also a return to the paper war. I fought the paper war of that winter in my classroom between 2 little brick stoves we had built on the Russian pattern, the heating system having naturally been destroyed by the Soviets. At this point I might touch on a problem which, even though it receded before the grave anxieties which the winter of 1941-2 was to cause us in the operational sphere, was always a matter of great concern to me. The man who commands an army is also its supreme arbiter, and the hardest task that can ever confront him is the confirmation of a death sentence. On one hand, it is his inexorable duty to maintain discipline and, in the troops' own interest, to inflict severe penalties for delinquency in action. On the other, it is a grim thought to know that one can snuff out a human life by a mere signature. Of course, death claims thousands of victims a day in war, and every soldier expects to have to lay down his life. Yet there is a very big difference between falling honourably in battle and facing the muzzles of one's comrades' rifles to be ignominiously erased from the ranks of the living. When, of course, a soldier had besmirched the honour of the army by some base action or culpably brought about the death of his comrades, there could be no mercy. But there were plenty of other cases caused not by sheer baseness of character, but by some perfectly explainable human lapse. Even so, the court-martial concerned had to pass the death sentence according to the full rigour of military law. In no case involving a death sentence was I ever content to base my final decision on the verbal elucidations of my army judges, admirable men though they were, but I always made a careful study of the files myself. When 2 soldiers in my corps were sentenced to death on the outbreak of war for raping and killing an old woman, they only received their just deserts. A very different case was that of a man who, after winning the Iron Cross in the Polish campaign, had been posted to a strange unit following a spell in hospital. On his very first day there, his whole machine-gun crew was killed, whereupon he lost his nerve and fled. By law, it is true, his life was forfeit, but there still seemed grounds in this instance, even though the man had been guilty of cowardice and thereby of endangering unit morale, for applying a different yardstick. As I could not immediately quash the sentence passed by the court-martial, the procedure I adopted in this and other such cases was to consult the man's regimental commander and, subject to the latter's agreement, to suspend the sentence for 4 weeks. If the man redeemed himself in action during this time, I quashed the sentence. If he failed again, it was carried out. Of all the condemned men to whom this probationary period was granted, only 1 went over to the enemy. All the others either proved their worth or died like true soldiers in the heavy fighting in the east. 11th Army's task now was to assault the enemy's last Crimean stronghold, Sevastopol. The sooner this was achieved, the less time the enemy would have to organise his defence, and the greater would be the prospect of success. What was more, it reduced the likelihood of an intervention from the sea. According to our calculations, the necessary troop movements and ammunition dumping would be complete by 27th or 28th November. Consequently, we made this the deadline for the start of the offensive. At this point, the Russian winter overtook us, its impact being all the more devastating by reason of the 2 different forms it took. In the Crimea itself, the rains came, very soon rendering all the unpaved roads there quite unusable. The mainland in the north, on the other hand, was already in the grip of severe frosts, which promptly immobilized 4 of the only 5 railway engines then available south of the Dnieper. In consequence, 11th Army often found its supplies reduced to as little as 1 or 2 trainloads a day. Though there was ice on the Dnieper, it still would not hold, and so far no ice-free bridges existed, and so the preparations for the assault dragged on. Instead of 27th November, the preliminary bombardment could not start until 17th December. At last, after a 3-week delay which was ultimately to prove crucial, 54 and 30 Corps were able to launch their attacks against the northern and southern sectors respectively. Prior to this, however, 11th Army had a difficult decision to make. On 17th of October, the critical turn of events around Rostov had caused the Army Group to order the immediate handover of 73 and 170 infantry divisions. Despite all our warnings that this would make it impossible to attack Sevastopol, we had only been allowed to keep 170 Division, which was still moving along the coast to join 30 Corps and would not have reached Rostov in time anyway. This concession did not alter the fact that the removal of 73 Division deprived the assault on the northern sector of its necessary reserve element, and we had to make up our minds whether in these circumstances we could afford to attack at all. In the event, we decided to risk it. It is not possible here to describe the course of the attack in detail. The first task was to drive the enemy, by a surprise thrust from the east, from his forward area between the Kacha and Belbek, and at the same time to capture his strong points in the Belbek Valley and along its southern elevation. Thereupon, the assault would be carried forward through the actual fortress Glacis south of the Belbek right up to Severnaya Bay. The main responsibility for the success of this battle lay with the valiant 22 Lower Saxon Infantry Division, under its outstanding commander, Lieutenant General Wolfe. It cleared the forward area between the Kacha and Belbek of the enemy, stormed the heights south of the Belbek Valley with 132 Infantry Division, and drove into the fortified zone proper to the south of the latter. But the spearhead of the attack was steadily narrowing, as 50 and 24 infantry divisions, whose task was to advance towards Severnaya Bay from the east, were not making any real progress in the difficult mountain country, parts of which were overgrown with almost impenetrable bush. The heavy fighting for the pillboxes, which the enemy defended with stubborn determination, was sapping the strength of our troops, and the severe cold to which they were henceforth exposed taxed their energies to the utmost. Nevertheless, in the last few days of December, the struggle having continued all through Christmas, the tip of the spearhead drew near to Fort Stalin, the capture of which would at least have given our artillery visual command of Severnaya Bay. All we needed now were fresh troops, and the drive to the bay was bound to succeed. But these were just what we had lacked since handing over 73 Division, and not even by drastically packing the assault divisions into the spearhead of the attack could we make good the loss. Such was the situation when the Soviet landings struck, first at Kerch and then at Feodosia. The threat was a deadly one, coming as it did at the very moment when the entire forces of the army, except for one German division and 2 Romanian brigades, were in action around Sevastopol. It was clear that we should have to throw forces from Sevastopol to the threatened points with the utmost speed. The slightest delay might prove fatal. But ought the attack on Sevastopol to be abandoned just when only one more push seemed necessary to gain command of Severnaya Bay? Furthermore, it would almost certainly be easier to disengage forces from Sevastopol after a success on the northern front than if one were to let go of the enemy prematurely. 11th Army accordingly decided to accept the risk involved in every further hour's postponement of the release of troops from Sevastopol. Initially, only 30 Corps was ordered to halt its assault, and 170 Division was dispatched to the threatened Kerch Peninsula. At the same time, with the agreement of the commander of 54 Corps and his divisional commanders, a final attempt was to be made on the northern front to reach the assault objective, Severnaya Bay. As always, the troops gave everything they had, and 22 Divisions Vanguard, 16 Infantry Regiment under Colonel Versacholtitz, actually penetrated the outer ring of Fort Stalin. By then, everyone's strength had given out, and on 30th December, the commanders of the assault divisions reported that no further attempts to carry on with the attack could be expected to succeed. After urgent representations by telephone through Army Group had convinced even Hitler that such action was necessary, 11th Army Headquarters issued orders for the attack to be finally stopped. Over and above this, it was reluctantly compelled to order the withdrawal of the northern front to the heights north of the Belbek Valley. But for these measures, the requisite forces could not have been released, to say nothing of the fact that the situation within the narrow confines of the spearhead would anyway have been untenable in the long run. Hitler's disapproval of this decision, which, though he could do nothing about it, clashed with the strict ban he had just placed on any voluntary withdrawals, weighed little in comparison with one's own responsibility to the troops who had sacrificed so much. And so the first attempt to storm the fortress of Sevastopol had failed. The Stalin offensive to reconquer the Crimea. The landing of Soviet troops on the Kerch Peninsula, catching 11th Army just when the battle on the northern front of Sevastopol had entered its crucial phase, soon proved to be more than a mere diversionary measure on the enemy's part. Soviet radio stations proclaimed that this was an all-out offensive to reconquer the Crimea, planned and commanded by Stalin personally, and that it would not end until 11th Army had been wiped off the map. That the threat was no empty one soon became apparent from the weight of enemy forces committed. Behind them, and in the utter ruthlessness with which they were expended, one sensed the brutal will of Stalin. On 26th of December, after crossing the Straits of Kerch, the enemy had begun by landing 2 divisions on either side of the city. Smaller landings followed on the northern coast of the peninsula. The position of 42 Corps, General Count Sponek, which depended solely on 46 Infantry Division for the defence of the peninsula, was certainly not an enviable one. Count Sponek accordingly requested permission to evacuate the peninsula in the hope that it could be sealed off at Parpash. 11th Army did not agree with him, for if the enemy succeeded in establishing a firm footing at Kerch, the upshot would be a second front in the Crimea, and an extremely dangerous situation for the entire army as long as Sevastopol remained untaken. Consequently, we ordered 42 Corps to strike while the enemy was still off balance after his landing and to hurl him back into the sea. At the same time, in order to keep the whole of 46th Division free for this task, we sent 4 and 8 Romanian mountain brigades, of which the former was around Simferopol and the latter engaged in guarding the eastern coast of the Crimea, to Feodosia to deal with any attempt the enemy might make to land at this critical spot. Simultaneously, orders were given to the only regimental group of 73 Division still in the Crimea, i.e. the reinforced 213 Infantry Regiment, to move on Feodosia from Jenicek. By 28th December, 46 Infantry Regiment actually succeeded in eliminating both the enemy beachheads north and south of Kerch, except for a small body of troops still fighting on the northern shore. In spite of this, Count Sponek again asked permission to evacuate the Kerch Peninsula. This we categorically forbade, still being convinced that any surrender of the Kerch Peninsula might well lead to a situation which the army would be unable to master with the forces at its disposal. Meanwhile, on 28th December, 54 Corps had moved off for its last attack on Sevastopol. Yet the enemy was on the point of delivering a new blow. Early on 29th December, we heard that he had carried out a night landing at Feodosia under cover of strong naval forces. Our own weak forces there, 1 engineer battalion, anti-tank troops and some coastal batteries, the Romanians not having started to arrive until the following morning, had been unable to stop the landing. Our telephone link with 42 Corps headquarters, which was located somewhere in the middle of the peninsula, was out of action, but at 1000 hours we were notified by radio that Count Sponek had ordered the immediate evacuation of the peninsula because of the new landings at Feodosia. Though we immediately issued a countermand, it was never picked up by 42 Corps signals. While fully appreciating the Corps' anxiety not to be cut off by the enemy at Feodosia, we still did not believe that the situation would in any way be improved by a headlong withdrawal. Simultaneously with countermanding the evacuation of the Kerch Peninsula, 11th Army ordered the Romanian Mountain Corps to throw the enemy forces disembarked at Feodosia straight back into the sea with the help of the 2 brigades mentioned earlier and a Romanian motorized regiment now in the process of moving up. Although we had no illusions about the offensive capacity of these Romanian formations, the enemy could still not be present at Feodosia in any real strength, and if we struck with real determination, it should be possible to catch him at a disadvantage. At the worst, we felt, the Romanians would manage to contain the enemy in a narrow beachhead around Feodosia until German troops could get there. Development of the situation on the Kerch Peninsula. Even this hope was to prove illusory, however. Far from carrying home its attack on Feodosia, the Romanian Mountain Corps actually allowed a handful of Soviet tanks to push it right back to a point east of Stary Krim. By a series of forced marches, 46th Infantry Division did in fact reach the narrow stretch of land at Parpash. In doing so, however, it had to abandon most of its guns on the ice-covered roads, and its troops arrived in a state of complete exhaustion. From the small beachhead still in his hands north of Kerch, the enemy was immediately able to take up the pursuit, the speed with which his reinforcements arrived being due to the freezing over of the straits. Had the Soviet commander pressed home his advantage properly by pursuing 46th Division really hard from Kerch and thrusting relentlessly after the Romanians as they fell back from Feodosia, the fate of the entire 11th Army would have been at stake. As it happened, he did not know when to take time by the forelock. Either he did not realize what a chance he had, or else he did not venture to seize it. And so it was possible, with the help of an exhausted 46th Division, 213 Infantry Regiment, which had meanwhile arrived from Jenicek, and the Romanians, to build up a protective front, albeit a perilously thin one, between the northern slopes of the Yaila Mountains near Stary Krim and the Zivash west of Akhmonai. In order to stiffen the Romanian troops and safeguard their heavy weapons, all available German officers and men, including those who could be spared from 11th Army headquarters, were attached to Romanian units. By 15th January 30 and 42, Corps were ready to counterattack on the Feodosia front. The decision to risk this attack was a hard one, for it had to be launched with 3.5 weakened German divisions and a Romanian mountain brigade against an opponent whose strength had meanwhile increased to 8 divisions and 1 brigade. The enemy, moreover, had a limited number of tanks at his disposal, whereas we had none at all. The support of the Luftwaffe was more than doubtful, since bad weather had prevented it from flying any sorties against Feodosia for the last few days. Nevertheless, we had to take the chance and attack. Thanks to the bravery of the troops, the attack succeeded, and by 18th of January, Feodosia was ours. In addition to 6,700 dead, the enemy had lost 10,000 prisoners, 177 guns, and 85 tanks. It now emerged that the Luftwaffe had still done a good job in Feodosia harbour, in spite of the bad flying conditions, and had sunk a number of transport vessels. Our success at Feodosia naturally led us to consider the possibility of immediately exploiting it to get the Soviet armies right out of the Kerch Peninsula. But desirable though this would have been, 11th Army decided, after careful reflection, that it could not be done with the resources available, especially now that a tank battalion and 2 bomber wings originally promised to us, the very forces we should have needed for the task in question, had to go to the Army Group. 11th Army thus had to dispense with any sweeping exploitation of its achievements at Feodosia and to content itself with throwing the enemy back as far as the Parpach bottleneck, where the Kerch Peninsula could be sealed off between the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. There was certainly nothing pusillanimous about this decision. We simply realized that after everything the troops had gone through to date, it might cause very serious reverses to demand too much of them now. Even though the recapture of Feodosia and the sealing off of the Kerch Peninsula at Parpach had temporarily banished a mortal danger, we did not let that lull us into a false sense of security. At that particular time, the enemy was striving everywhere on the Eastern Front to make good his defeats of the previous summer and to regain the initiative. Why should he make an exception of the Crimea, where his mastery of the sea offered him such exceptionally good prospects? Success here could have decisive repercussions on the entire situation in the East, politically with regard to Turkey and economically through the recovery of a base for air operations against the Romanian oil fields. Another point to consider was that Soviet propaganda had linked the offensive against the Crimea so closely with the name of Stalin that it was most unlikely to be called off. And sure enough, we soon discovered that the enemy was pushing reinforcements across to Kerch. Having possession of the frozen straits, he could put up with the loss of the port of Feodosia. Air photography continually showed the enemy to be concentrated in strength in his Black Sea harbours and the airfields in the area north of the Caucasus, and as early as 29th January, intelligence estimates of his strength on the Parpach front amounted to more than 9 divisions, 2 rifle brigade groups, and 2 independent tank brigades. The Sevastopol front was also livening up again, particularly where the artillery was concerned. After weeks of outward calm that were really loaded with tension, the enemy finally launched his big offensive on 27th of February. The heavy battles that followed on both the Parpach and Sevastopol fronts continued with unremitting violence until 3rd March. Then on both sides a period of exhaustion ensued. On the Parpach front, we had eventually succeeded in containing the enemy breakthrough in the northern sector by making effective use of the marshlands there.